All right. We ready to lock and load? If I start talking, they will come. If you speak, they will come. I know some were needing to purchase with a card. Don't let me forget to do that after maybe this first session here. So we've got this session I'm about to start plus the Q&A. So if you've got any questions that you might want to ask, be sure to think through those, and we'll dig into those at the Q&A after this session. All right, so we've really laid out the important aspects of the creation model by looking at what the Bible has to say about this subject, keeping in mind, again, that we can know, we don't have a blind faith about this. We can know that God exists. We can know that it's the God of the Bible, that the Bible is inspired, which means the flood happened. And what we've seen is that the events of creation and the flood, they're going to play a big role in how we understand the evidence around us, and the evidence supports what happened in the flood. So the next question is can our model, the biblical model, the creation model, that framework for viewing the evidence, can it explain the evidence from science and history? Does it harmonize with the evidence? Can it withstand scrutiny? Can we defend this model? And as I've described it here, can we defend it as we're told to do in 1 Peter 3:15? So in this session and the session tomorrow morning, we're going to answer those questions. And so these sessions will illuminate why these previous ones have been important to know and have clarity on in order to allow us to be able to respond to the challenges being made by critics. So as we look at the attacks being made against creation, you'll hear me several times point back to this model that we've laid out in previous sessions and giving an answer to these charges. Now, what I want to do in this session and the session tomorrow morning is use as our test case some of the things that were brought up in the Bill Nye-Ken Ham debate. This is back in 2013. Raise your hand if you have seen this debate. Raise your hand if you know about this debate. Okay, if you at least know about it. All right. So Bill Nye, the pseudoscience guy, squared off against Ken Ham, right? So Bill Nye, he's a famous science guy, big-time evolutionist. Ken Ham was the CEO at Answers in Genesis, which is probably the largest of the young earth creation organizations that are out there. There's three pretty big ones, and he's over Answers in Genesis. They're the ones that have the Creation Museum and the Ark Encounter. And so these are denominational groups, but in this debate, so this was not over evolution, right? This was over creation, right? So this highlighted to me the importance of making sure that we have our model and we can defend it, not just show the issues with evolution, but we got to be ready to defend what the Bible says on this stuff too. And so Bill Nye brought up, I feel like, some great points that gave the creation model an opportunity to see whether it is defensible, whether it's a robust model that can be defended. And to be honest, I didn't feel good about Ken Ham's responses to the questions that Bill Nye brought up. Ken Ham did great when he was just presenting his lectures that he had prepared, but when they opened the floor up to being able to challenge the model, then Bill Nye brought up several great points that Ken Ham didn't really deal with well, and it kind of left the impression to the millions of people that have seen that as though the creation model can't really defend against these attacks, which really bothers me. One of the points that Bill Nye brought up over and over repeatedly in this debate was, so far, Mr. Ham and his worldview, the creation model, does not have this capability. It cannot make predictions and show results. The big thing I want from you, Mr. Ham, is can you come up with something that you can predict? Do you have a creation model that predicts something that will happen in nature? So remember, we're not talking about predictive prophecy here. He's talking about scientific predictions. So can we really do science? Do we have theories and a model that make it where we can make a prediction and say, okay, if we're right about this, then when we carry out this experiment or go do this or do that, we'll find this to be the case. So according to him, we can't do that. And so after this debate, I wrote a Reason and Revelation article that was very lengthy, responding to a lot of the stuff that Bill and I brought up because there was so much that needed to be hashed out that Ken Ham didn't deal with. And I brought copies of that back there for you to take a look at. You can grab those. Those are free. And we're just going to go. So one of the things that I did is I made a list of, several predictions. I don't remember if it was 30. I think it was maybe 30 predictions that I made in just a few minutes that highlight the fact that creationists have been able to make predictions based on the biblical model. And I want to plow through a few of these. I talk about a lot of these in the Science versus Evolution seminar. We looked at this idea, the appearance of age idea, cause and effect, life producing according to its kind, deal with that in the other one too. Let's see here. Evidence of the coexistence of humans and dinosaurs. I do that actually in a dinosaur day I do for teens. So let's look at number 12 just for the sake of time. There's so much to cover. I just can't cover all these that are on the list. We would predict that we would find evidence that the dinosaurs lived in the not too distant past because again, according to the creation model, dinosaurs and humans were both created on day 6, roughly 6,000 to 7,000 years ago. And so we would expect to find evidence that they didn't live so long ago. And in fact, we have found evidence of this coexistence of human dinosaurs in the both historical, archaeological, and biblical evidence of the coexistence of humans and dinosaurs. But looking at number 12, though, do we have evidence that the dinosaurs lived in the not too distant past? Well, interestingly, in the past couple decades, a powerful form of evidence has come to light verifying creationist predictions. Scientists have been cracking open dinosaur fossils that are supposed to be millions of years old, and yet discovering collagen and blood vessels with red blood cells still intact. Soft, stretchy, flexible tissue where they could be pulled apart, let it go, and it would snap back together. In multiple species, now dozens of species, now not even just the dinosaurs, but in the pterosaurs, so the flying reptiles, as well as the marine reptiles have been found. Mary Schweitzer was the evolutionist that originally published on this years ago in Science magazine, and so she published this, and the evolutionary community, of course, crucified her over it, even though she's an evolutionist. There's no way. This has got to be contamination of somewhere. There's no way that that's what you found. So she's like, all right, fair enough. She goes back and is even more meticulous to make sure there's no contamination. She finds the same thing. And so everybody starts breaking open their fossils, and now it's commonplace to find this. Biomaterials being found in these fossils is very common. And keeping in mind that these are all supposed to be at least 65 million years old, some of them 100 million. 200 million years old. And so they're trying to figure out, how could you do this? Well, maybe if you do this, or maybe if you do this. And none of the suggestions they've been able to come up with can really withstand muster. They're not robust explanations. Of course, it makes perfect sense if they're not really that old. Like we would argue the dinosaurs are being killed and buried in those strata towards the end of the flood, right? That's what's going on there. And it should come as no surprise that C14 is being found in dinosaur fossils. Now, the significance of this is carbon dating. Okay, there's different kinds of dating methods out there. You've probably heard of carbon dating. If someone tells you that carbon dating proves the Earth's millions of years old, you immediately know that person is ignorant about carbon dating because it can't be used for that. You'd use other radiometric dating methods to try to prove that, but not carbon dating. With carbon dating, C14 dating, if you have a creature die, okay, its bone starts out with say 100% carbon 14. And the half-life of carbon-14, 5,730 years. So what we mean by that is after 5,730 years, half of that original carbon-14 content will change into nitrogen-14 in 5,730 years. And that's assuming a constant decay rate, which creationists have shown that's not a good assumption. But even assuming that, 5,730 years, you have half of the original carbon-14 left in your bone. After another 5,730 years, you have half of what was left. So now you're down to a quarter of the original C14. Another 5,730 years, you have now an eighth. And you keep doing that, you get to a point about 50,000 years ago when the amount of the original carbon-14 is so small, we don't have the technology to detect it anymore. So if you can detect carbon-14, you know it's not even 50,000 years old, based on their own assumptions. How are we finding carbon-14 in dinosaur fossils then? They're supposed to be 65 million years old, right? Major problem, but exactly what you'd expect from a creationist perspective. Number 13, if the Earth is relatively young, you'd predict that geological processes assumed to take eons will be found to be able to occur rapidly, like petrification. All right, so we were able to make specific predictions about this, and sure enough, we're finding this is very common in the literature to find evidence of rapid petrification when you have catastrophic conditions. So just as a single example, in 2004, Japanese scientists published their research on rapid petrification in the journal Sedimentary Geology, and they were studying mineral-rich acidic water from the explosion crater of the Tateyama volcano in central Japan. Water runs over the edge of this volcano as a waterfall. Some wood had fallen in the path of this mineral-rich water, and they found the wood had petrified within 36 years. And so they decided to go ahead and do some intentional experiments, putting some of the wood into the path of this water and so forth, and they found that silica petrification could occur in only 7 years. Also in 2004, a paper was published on the rapid silicification of plants in Yellowstone, and they found within 11 months these plants had already had enough silicification that the plant tissues had been stabilized against collapse, and the plant structure was replicated. And so again, exactly what you'd expect. Coal, oil, and diamonds, once thought to take millions of years to form as well. Scientists now acknowledge they don't always take a long time. Laboratory experiments have verified coal can form in a matter of days, hours, even minutes. With heat being the primary requirement, you have to have the right conditions, which I'll grant. The flood is unique conditions, I'll grant that, but it does produce the exact conditions necessary to make certain things happen quickly. Volcanic clay accelerates the process along with moderate pressure. The 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens verified the fact that catastrophic conditions can create the environment necessary for rapid coal production. And so the flood would have provided the perfect circumstances for that. Now, as with oil, scientists have discovered that it doesn't necessarily, as with coal, scientists have discovered it doesn't necessarily take a long time for oil to form as well. It can be formed rapidly in laboratories, of course, but also in nature. For example, the Guaymas Basin, which is a trench in the Gulf of Mexico, has a 1,500-foot thick layer of material that's been deposited by billions of these tiny organisms. And as hot geothermal waters move through this ooze, it's being rapidly converted to oil and natural gas. Diamonds are thought to be millions of years old, but scientists regularly discover the presence of C14 in diamonds that, remember, should be at undetectable levels in anything older than even 50,000 years old. So even diamonds are not as old as scientists have long thought. So creationists would argue something happened within the last few thousand years that sped up the decay of, for example, carbon, aging them initially, and then not enough time has since passed to allow for the complete decay of the C14 within. So diamonds are thousands, not millions of years. Number 14, if the Earth is relatively young, we'd predict evidence would be uncovered indicating that the layers of the geologic column can form rapidly as well, that the sediment can be deposited and then lithify rapidly. And one such example comes from what we call polystrate fossils. These are fossils that that will cut across multiple layers of strata, like, for example, this tree or this one. Now, if those layers took millions of years to be deposited and then actually lithify, you'd have to argue what? That this tree is sticking up out of the ground for millions of years as this material finally gets deposited around it. Of course, that doesn't happen. What happens as a tree gets older? I mean, it falls down and dies, right? I mean, it doesn't stay there. It deteriorates, right? Instead, what's going on here is you've got some kind of massive catastrophic mud flow carrying this material some distance. This, of course, is the kind of thing that you see at petrified forests, where you've got material like this being transported in a big flow. And we see actual modern examples of what happens when you do this, like at Mount St. Helens. You know, Mount St. Helens is an amazing opportunity to see a lot of the effects of the flood in a microcosm. Okay, that volcanic eruption that happened and all the things we learned from it. There's some fascinating things that you learn about trees. Here I'm going down a rabbit hole I don't have time to do, but it's just too cool for me to not tell you about it. So one of the things that happened in the explosion from that volcanic action, these trees get moved down to Spirit Lake at the base of Mount St. Helens, which, by the way, they're still there today. It's been like over 40 years. They're still there. This massive log mat of trees, all of their bark was removed from rubbing against each other and stuff. And they go and they're piling up there on this lake. And as that bark is falling down, guess what's forming at the bottom of this lake? It's starting to form peat. It's starting to rapidly create coal in a short amount of time. Okay, one of the things they've watched happen with these trees, some of the trees still have their root ball attached to them. And so it gets waterlogged and it drops. And the tree will go ahead and fall to the ground and basically replant. Okay, it's not actually replanted, but if that lake ever drained, what do you think it's going to look like to later geologists? It's going to look like it grew there. Okay, now at Yellowstone, there are multiple petrified forests on top of each other. This has been one of the arguments for an old Earth. I mean, you get an entire forest, and it had to grow and then petrify, and a whole nother one had to grow. I mean, this is evidence of hundreds of thousands of years. No, at Mount St. Helens, we see exactly what's going on. These trees fall down like that, replant, start getting covered up, and then the next species of plant, they fall down based on their species type. So it looks like an entire forest of, say, Douglas fir trees, and then a whole different kind of forest above that gets planted above that, because for some, they tend to fall down based on, I'm sure, the density and so forth of the wood. And so they fall out on top of each other as separate forests. Isn't that amazing? And this is not something you would expect if you're thinking uniformitarian, like what do we see happening? You need catastrophic conditions to help you properly interpret what you're seeing. And that is exactly what we're getting to see at Mount St. Helens. Anyway, I did not intend to go down that rabbit hole. Trees, calamites, catfish have all been uncovered as polystrate fossils. A really famous one is this 80-foot long baleen whale that was found in a diatomaceous earth core in California. So polystrate fossils are evidence that sediment can accumulate rapidly. Each of those strata don't take millions of years to form. You just need catastrophic conditions. Number 15, secular geologists argue that uniformitarianism is true, although there is some movement away from strict uniformitarianism, but evolutionary dating methods are all based on the assumption of uniformitarianism. And so if uniformitarianism is conceded, you're conceding all evidence for an old Earth, because they're all based in some way on the idea that the present is the key to the past with regard to rates and so forth. But according to uniformitarianism, whatever process is going on today have always gone on in essentially the same way throughout time. So if a stream is going through a canyon, slowly removing its sediment, then it's assumed it's always done that in that same slow way. The creation model, again, if it's true, we'd predict canyons can form rapidly because things have not always gone on in the same way they do today. Well, again, looking back at Mount St. Helens and what we learned from that event, March 19th, 1982, there's a small eruption at the summit of Mount St. Helens. It caused a massive mud flow. Within one day, a 20-mile long, 140-foot deep canyon was carved. It completely nullifies uniformitarianism. If uniformitarianism is true, you look at this stream that's going through here today and you calculate, well, how much sediment is being removed from this stream today? And then you calculate back, you figure out, okay, well, it needs this much sediment to fill up this canyon. Well, we can figure out exactly how old this canyon is. No, that's going to give you incorrect assumptions because you didn't take into account the effect of a major catastrophic event that occurred. The Lake Missoula flood is a well-documented flood from the Ice Age. Water breached an ice dam and 500 cubic miles of water, 10 times the combined flow of all the rivers in the world, were released in 2 days. It destroyed 16,000 square miles of terrain, cut hundreds of feet through solid rock, creating canyons, carving 50 cubic miles of earth. If the earth is relatively young, number 16, but evolutionary dating methods say it's old, we'd predict that evidence would come forth indicating evolutionary dating methods have flawed assumptions, and so we'd want to dig into these specific assumptions, and that evidence is coming more and more readily available. Evolutionary dating methods are built upon at least 3 fundamental assumptions that each have been shown to have major problems, and I write on this on our website. There's the book, The Young Earth by John Morris and Frank Sherwin that provides modern scientific evidence of that claim, showing the issue with each of these dating methods. So, uranium, lead, rubidium, strontium, potassium, argon, these kind of dating methods that argue for rocks that are hundreds of millions to billions of years have major assumption problems. But let's just, for the sake of time, look at some recent news regarding just one of these assumptions, the first one. So whenever these dating methods, let me go back here. So if you have a rock that you're dating, and this rock has both uranium and lead in it, then you can use the uranium-lead dating method. And as long as you know what the half-life of uranium is, you could, theoretically, get the age of that rock. So let's say you have a rock and you do a content analysis, you count up how much uranium's in there, how much lead's in there, and you find it's half uranium, half lead, then it has gone through 1 half-life. Okay, so then you say, well, it would take 1 half-life to get from a rock that was completely uranium to a rock that's half uranium, half lead. As long as you know what that half-life age is, then you could get the age of that rock. Well, there's problems with that because you assume some things. Like you assume, for example, that the decay of uranium into lead remained constant that whole time. Number 2, you assume that it was originally completely uranium, your rock. What if it originally had uranium and lead in it? And number 3, you assume that that rock was a closed system. There wasn't ever anything that happened that added uranium or lead to that rock or took some away, right? So you assume it's a closed system. So these are fundamental assumptions of all of these radiometric dating methods that have each been shown empirically to be terrible assumptions. But let's just look at that first one, though, for the sake of time. So in 2009, the European Organization for Nuclear Research, CERN, these are the guys that found the God particle. I don't know if you remember that story years ago, the Higgs boson particle. They announced research that indicated that the nuclear decay rates don't appear to be always constant. What they found, and as far as I know, they were not actually intending to discover this, but they discovered that if you have thorium-228 in water with ultrasonic cavitation going on, it increased the decay rate of thorium-228 by a factor of 10,000. So basically, if the flood is happening, it increases the decay rate of thorium-228 by a factor of 10,000. That means it immediately is going to make anything old, any of these rocks that are old or that look old, it's going to age them very quickly. That's what we're saying. So water ultrasonic cavitation equals, in other words, I'll grant you Major catastrophic conditions that you don't generally see happening today. Okay, but if you have flood conditions, it will significantly raise the decay rate, at least of thorium-228. I'd like to see this done on a lot of the other elements, which is something we'd love to do. If you want to give us a whole lot of money, where we can go do that kind of nuclear research. I even have a guy who's a nuclear engineer who does some writing for us and would love to do it. In 2010, research by a team at Purdue was released that's discovered that radioactive decay rates, in fact, vary with the sun's rotation. All right, so things going on in the sun seems to be affecting decay rates over here. And again, they didn't set out to find this. They just found it on accident while they were doing another study. So these dating methods, these decay rates are supposed to be constant. There's not supposed to be anything that could happen that would change these. If there can be conditions that could change these decay rates, it calls into question the age of any of these rocks that have been dated. All right, if the Bible indicates the earth is relatively young, the creation model would predict evidence of that claim to surface. And it has. Many different lines of evidence point to a young earth. I've got an article called 21 Reasons to Believe the Earth is Young that goes into a lot of this. And I actually have a whole seminar that's devoted just to the age of the earth. But let's just look at 2 or 3 examples here. For example, the moon is receding from the earth at a rate of about 4 centimeters per year at present, but it's not a linear recession. So when the moon was closer to the earth, it was receding faster, and so it's slowing down in its recession. So based on the equation that describes the recession, scientists can calculate where the moon would have been compared to the earth at different times in history. And so we know, for example, 6,000 years ago, the moon would have been about 800 feet closer to the earth than it is today. Not a big deal, not a problem. But if the moon is as old as they say it is, it's a problem. Evolutionists argue that the moon is 4.5 billion years old. Now, 1.5 billion years ago, based on the recession rate, the moon would have been touching the earth. So it'd be physically impossible to be older than that. So they would have to try to explain this away by saying the recession rate must have been different in the past. See the problem there? You've now given up on uniformitarianism. That's our point. Uniformitarianism is a bad assumption. You can't use present rates to make these assessments about things in the past. The moon can't be as old as they claim if uniformitarianism is true. Another example, in the area of population statistics, evolutionists argue that humans have been on the planet some 2 to 3 million years, the genus Homo, that includes Homo sapiens. So using statistical equations, we can get an estimate of how many people should be on the earth if that were true. So given conservative estimates, accounting for disease, war, famine, and so forth, and also if we assume humans have just been on the earth for 1 million years rather than 2 to 3 million years, there should be 10 to the 2,000th power people on the earth today. Now, you probably don't even know what that means. Right, so let's try to get our mind around this. Okay, if the known universe was 28 billion light years in diameter, they're actually now saying it's even bigger than that, but let's just stick with 28 billion light years. If you were to take miniature humans, 3 feet tall, narrow at the shoulders, squeezed them like sardines into the universe, you could squeeze 10 to the 82nd power people into the whole universe. Now notice that leaves a few more humans, right? In other words, a ridiculous number of humans, enough to completely pack 10 to the 1,918 other universes, to completely fill up that many more universes. And remember, this is just based on humans being around 1 million years, not 2 to 3 million years. Now, they'd probably say, well, there couldn't be that many people on Earth because there's not enough resources. So all those extra people would start dying out, around 50 billion, which they argue is the Earth's capacity. So then there should be evidence that that capacity was reached multiple times in the past. And so there should be billions upon billions of hominid fossils proving that contention, right? These are predictions. You should be able to go and follow these predictions out and see if they bear out with actual evidence. We find there's no evidence of billions upon billions of hominid fossils. And again, according to their own guys, They say they barely have enough to fill one coffin. That's their own words on it. Not billions upon billions. The mathematical gymnastics that have to be done to try to make this work doesn't work. Now, if we adjust our calculations based on the contention that creation is true, we'd argue that about 4,350 years ago, 6 people began the repopulation of the earth, right? Noah's sons and wives. And if that's the case, there should be 6.7 to 8.1 billion people on the planet today, which is pretty close. Another example, scientists have been measuring the Earth's magnetic field intensity with precision since the 1800s, and they've determined that the Earth's magnetic field is decaying, and it even has a half-life of 1,100 years. So again, if we use uniformitarianism, as they do, and we start calculating back in time, and we double the Earth's magnetic field intensity every 1,100 years, we get to a point 30,000 years ago when the magnetic field would have been so strong, it would have been comparable to a neutron star, right? It would have created immense heat that would have been catastrophic to Earth. The Earth's internal structure likely couldn't have even sustained the immense heat. It'd be impossible for life to exist. And yet evolutionists say life has been around not 30,000 years, but 3.8 billion years. So if the Earth is young, again, this is not a problem. But again, their argument would have to be, well, the magnetic field half-life must have been different in the past. Exactly. Uniformitarianism is a bad assumption. So several other scientific dating methods are available that make this same point over and over and over and show you dozens of times that you can't use uniformitarian thinking and try to date things. And yet all of their dating methods are based on this principle. They just pick and choose the ones that fit with the numbers they need and ignore all these other ones. You can't do that if you're being rational. Number 18, evolution predicts that life has evolved into more complex forms, and intelligence has gradually increased over time, moving from this ape-like creature into what we enjoy today, starting with that single-celled organism originally. Ancient man is, remember, depicted as dumb cavemen grunting and beating things with their clubs, basically like we do today. Incapable of intelligent thought, like today, and only developing more sophisticated technology as our brains evolve to a point where we can do that. Now, the creation model would actually predict the opposite. God made man fully formed and perfect. His brain was in genes were pristine condition, without genetic defect or mutation. His ability to think probably more quickly, think more deeply, to reason could have exceeded our own. A man before the flood could have been capable of amazing things because humans are living for hundreds of years. Imagine what you could do if you took whatever thing you've studied for the last 40, 50 years and multiply that by like 20, right? How good would you be at that? And how advanced would you be in your thinking on that subject? So the Bible verifies humans were already intelligent at the beginning, right? Genesis chapter 4, we see, by the time of even Adam's grandson, they're building cities. And we've got them using tents and livestock and playing musical instruments, working with bronze and iron. Already practices thought to have taken hundreds of thousands of years for man to be able to develop. So the evolutionary model would predict this continual increase in human advancement and intelligence and enlightenment as humans evolve. The creation model would predict that advancement doesn't have to do with intelligence so much as it does, number one, entropy. As the human genome continues to degenerate, our bodies and brains aren't capable of doing what they would have been able to do even 6,000 years ago. So we'd predict a gradual decline in various aspects of humanity. But also, number two, we'd predict that human advancement has to do with the state of a society, the decisions its leaders are making, whether that society creates an atmosphere that encourages learning and research and exploration, how free a society is to exercise its God-given talents, and of course, whether or not that society is behaving morally in a way that God will bless it providentially. And so advancement would be expected to be up and down throughout history. And of course, when a society collapses, you'd expect much of that advancement to come to a halt and many times disappear. And Scripture prophesies that there would be these civilizations that would be wiped out. They'd become desolate and a byword. And sure enough, the more archaeologists are digging around, the more, number one, they discover highly advanced civilizations, amazingly, many times buried beneath what are today less civilized people. There'll be third world countries living on top of civilizations that were more advanced than them in the past. Exactly the opposite of what should be the case. So an evolution in intelligence clearly didn't happen. So as they're digging around, they find amazing discoveries that prove the great intelligence of ancient man. Again, I've been reading a lot about this in papers that are coming out where people are realizing, oh man, these guys could do more than we thought, all the way back to those initial hominid fossils that show up after the flood. So they're finding amazing architecture and structures that many times are still a mystery as to how the ancients were able to create these. So they've found evidence of advanced ancient human intelligence from all over the world, ancient boats able to hold many people, precise maps, advanced astronomy, even though they didn't have the tools we have today, advanced chemistry, hydraulic engineering, and weaponry. Solid evidence indicates that the Nazca people of Peru, flourishing 2,000 years ago, were already able to perform successful skull surgery to relieve pressure on the brain from battle wounds. They built some sophisticated aqueducts, many of which are still functioning today, 2,000 years later. Puquillos. Ancient towers, ziggurats, pyramids, all over the world, abilities which societies had, and then the technology often disappeared with the collapse of that society, only to be discovered by archaeologists hundreds or thousands of years later. The Nazca people, again, flourishing 2,000 years ago, drew these enormous, precise pictures called geoglyphs on the ground. They were actually featured in the fourth Indiana Jones movie. And these are so enormous that many of them weren't even discovered until we flew over them. And so it raises all these questions about not only how did they know how to do these so precisely, but what were they being used for? And theories abound about that. The 1930s, archaeologists discovered ancient batteries, proving that people in Baghdad had figured out the science of batteries as early as 250 BC. In 2006, the New York Times ran a piece announcing the discovery of ancient Peruvian canals used for irrigation farming, and they're thought to go all the way back to the time of Abraham. Craig Morris of the American Museum of Natural History said their use of slope and management of water flow shows again that ancient people were a lot smarter and more observant than we often give them credit for. And again, this is very common for me to see this. Humans have always been intelligent. And again, the creation model would predict that would have been the case even in ancient times. It's no big surprise to us. Now, it's true that we have advanced technology today that presumably is beyond what anybody has been able to do in the past, keeping in mind that we don't really know what was capable before the flood, right? That whole civilization is gone. And so who knows what they might have been able to do, what they had discovered. But does advanced technology mean that humans have gotten like smarter, really? So if you really think about the major discoveries that have caused the technological boom that we've experienced in the last 100 years, so electricity, telephones, the internal combustion engine, airplanes, computers, the microchip and so forth, these can be traced back many times to these individuals that either accidentally stumbled across a discovery or designed something after many, many trials and errors. It wasn't about being more evolved. So after we discover something, we're really good at building on that discovery and inventing things. And we have more people on the planet. And since one of the things that we discovered was how to quickly communicate between countries, that allows progress to happen quickly. But the primary discoveries themselves that spark all the technology are often lucky breaks. Or, as we might really view it, providential blessings, especially whenever you go back and see how many of them came like from our own country and would be viewed as providential blessings by God because of how our country used to be. Now, if the pre-flood world had stumbled across, say, electricity, I mean, who knows what they would have been capable of doing and building on that knowledge when you consider that they lived so long. Number 19, the Bible mentions giant humans. We'd expect there to be evidence surfaced that supports that claim. So are giants a mythical idea? Apparently not, at least according to evolutionists. By the way, I go into so much of this in my book, Flooded, so be sure to make all those go away. Purchase those. Don't throw them away. But the popular science podcast called The Naked Scientists, weird, I know, but this is Cambridge University's podcast. They conducted an interview with Lee Berger in 2007. Lee Berger is a very well-known paleoanthropologist, University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. He's been in the news a lot over the last couple decades because he found probably the two biggest finds of this century so far, Australopithecus sediba and Homo naledi. So this group had an opportunity to go visit his fossil collection at the university where he's at, and they discussed the fossils of his museum. So in the article following the interview, Chris Smith, the editor, says one of the most interesting things that the fossil record reveals is that we went through a period of extreme giantism. These were people routinely over 7 feet tall. They were huge. So Berger said, you've probably heard the myth that ancient humans were tiny, and some of them were tiny, but as we move through the period of 0.5 million to 300,000 years ago in Africa, they go through a period of giantism. He then proceeds to show this group an example of one of the giant femurs from a species dubbed Homo heidelbergensis. And he says, they are huge. That's so big, we can't even calculate how big this individual was. You'd need an NBA basketball player to get someone of the height someone like this would have been, something like over 7 feet tall. So these are enormous fossils. They really don't even know how large the person would have to be that had these bones. He just surmises over 7 feet tall. So Smith responds and says, well, is this extreme size maybe just some weird abnormality? And Berger says no, because we found a lot of them. Everywhere we find them enormous. These are what we call archaic Homo sapiens. Some people refer to them as Homo heidelbergensis. These individuals are extraordinary. They are giants. So notice, first of all, that Berger acknowledges they're humans. They're Homo sapiens, though ancient. But they're huge. They're giant-like. And it's not just some weird abnormality. There seemed to be a race of these guys. And if Homo heidelbergensis isn't big enough for you, back in 1944, Rolf von Koenigswald of the Netherlands Indies Geological Survey found some enormous jawbones. Time magazine ran an article announcing the discovery. Notice the title, Giants in Those Days, quoting from Genesis 6:4. Koenigswald first found a big jawbone which looked more human than Pithecanthropus's, but was so massive that he thought it could not possibly be a man's. And then he found a still larger jaw, the biggest ever discovered, which was unmistakably human. It was apparently the most primitive, truly human fossil ever discovered. Koenigswald named it Meganthropus paleojavanicus. That's hard to say that, isn't it? Koenigswald's crowning find dwarfed even Meganthropus. He found 3 astounding teeth. They were 6 times as big as a modern man's molars. Weidenreich is sure from the pattern of their biting surfaces that they are definitely human. So evidence of enormous humans. He goes on, he has named this man monster Gigantanthropus. Weidenreich now believes that gigantism and massiveness may have been a general or at least widespread character of early mankind. Now, it's possible these aren't even references to the giants like Goliath. I would hypothesize that the ancient world, especially the pre-flood environment, may have been more conducive to a larger size human too, not just the animals and the plants that we already know were bigger, but the humans as well, which is what Weidenreich is suggesting. And so you may have seen in those early post-flood individuals, people that were being born, there may have been much bigger humans. But maybe not. Notice again, we have scientific evidence verifying biblical predictions that helps to substantiate the creation model. Now, if the fossil evidence isn't enough, we can look around today and see examples of extremely large people, even though we're thousands of years beyond the optimal period of human health and longevity. You think of giants, first person I always thought of as a kid was Andre the Giant. died in 1993. He was only 7 feet 4 inches. He was short compared to the tallest man alive today, Sultan Kosin, 8 feet 3 inches tall. Now, his immense height, they think, is from a pituitary condition in his case that resulted in an overproduction of growth hormone. According to the Guinness Book of World Records, the tallest man in medical history that has been reliably confirmed was Robert Vodlow, died in 1940, measuring in 1 inch shy of 9 feet. Weighed 491 pounds at one point. So the giants of the Bible were not mythical beings, real humans, albeit big ones. Number 20, if the flood happened, we'd predict that stories from such a cataclysmic event would be preserved as ancient oral traditions or in writings. All right, I mean, if you knew about the flood, wouldn't you pass that down? It's like if you had lived through it. Since the flood would have been before the time when apparently writing is happening, the stories would have initially been oral, right? And so you'd expect similar stories, whenever they split up at Babel, you'd expect there to be distortions now that get passed down, and you'd have corruptions of the original story. But you'd expect there to still be stories of it. Sure enough, there are hundreds of these ancient legends about a global flood. Here's just a few examples. In Greece, you have the flood legend. Zeus wanted to destroy humans with a flood and start over. Deucalion and his wife were put in a large wooden chest. A flood comes that covers almost all the mountain peaks. In Babylon, Utnapishtim is warned by a god to build a boat in preparation for a terrible flood. He covers the boat with pitch, brings animals of all kinds and provisions, sends out a dove to see if the flood had receded, then a swallow, then a raven which didn't return. Isn't this interesting? And then they leave the boat and worship their gods. That one may be the one that goes farthest back. Toltec Indians tell of a great flood that destroyed the first world. Notice 1,716 years after creation. That's very close to the Hebrew text. A few people escaped in a closed chest. Learned about the Anasazi flood legend when I was studying Grand Canyon years ago. In China, God sent a messenger to tell 3 sons of a flood. Dumb listened, ironically, and built a wooden boat. Everybody's awake, right? And then a huge flood came to cover the whole earth. Dumb is saved, and he has 3 sons that repopulate the earth. So amazing similarities. They don't exactly match the Bible perfectly, but you wouldn't expect them to. If they did match, you'd think there'd been some kind of collusion over this. In the books, The Discovery of Genesis and Genesis and the Mystery Confucius Couldn't Solve, Nelson even argues that the origin of the Chinese word for boat is comprised of the ancient forms of the words for vessel, 8, and mouth, or people. All right, so notice that. The word boat comprised of an 8-people vessel, right? Nelson makes a case for several other Chinese words being traced back to the flood and the Tower of Babel and even creation, and also argues from historical evidence that the Chinese were originally monotheistic. Ultimately, every ancient culture would have originally been monotheistic, right? That's what you'd expect. So again, hundreds of these major, these legends of a major global flood, and the resemblances to Scripture in many cases are notable, just as we'd predict to be the case if the flood actually occurred. Now, in light of the catastrophic nature of the flood, as well as the drastic change in lifespans after the flood, we'd expect that during and after the flood, for a period of time, there'd probably be evidence of irregular rates for processes that today are constant and slow, like nuclear decay rates, tectonic plate movement, tree ring growth, ice layer accumulation, and so forth. And some of this has been discussed, and we'll talk more about some of that tomorrow morning. So number 22, we'd expect evidence that catastrophism, rapid burial from catastrophes rather than uniformitarian burial, explains much of the geologic column, especially the fossils. And we looked at polystrate fossils already, but you also have dinosaur graveyards. Okay, so I did dinosaur excavation up in Wyoming, where on this single ranch, There are over 5,000 dinosaurs buried there. Okay, and they're not like little guys. We're talking, I was witnessing 2 Triceratops skulls being dug up. Full-size Triceratops, like Nanotyrannus is there, Pachycephalosaurus. I was digging up Edmontosaurus fossils, and it's not just 5,000 creatures, but they're torn to bits and pieces. Like something happens to obliterate these guys and then transport them a long enough distance where they're organized in a graded bone bed, where the bigger fossils are at the bottom and then they get smaller as you go up, indicating a single event, and they were transported by some kind of mud flow that organizes them by gravity. Now, what would be powerful enough to kill over 5,000 huge dinosaurs, tear them to shreds, and transport them a long enough distance to organize their bones? Okay, this is evidence of the flood, and it's right over there to the east of the Rocky Mountains, and those seismites that I mentioned earlier are some of these dinosaur fossils are sticking out of these seismite layers, these massive earthquake-type structures. So they have found over 30,000 dinosaur fossils in this small area there. This is several of the quarries that we are looking at. Many fossils show evidence of rapid burial, catastrophic deposition. This is an aspiration fossil. Notice the fish is in the middle of its dinner when it gets hit by something, some kind of catastrophic burial process. Ichthyosaur, pre-flood marine reptile. Notice it gets hit when it's in the middle of giving birth, right, to another ichthyosaur. This is one of the reasons we know that ichthyosaurs gave live birth. Many times, dinosaur fossils, if you actually find them articulated like this, where you can actually see their structure, what they look like in life, usually they're just bits and pieces, individual bones, but if you can find them articulated, it's very typical to find them in this posture where their tail's curved up, their head's thrown back. A lot of times their mouth is open, they're gasping for water as though they have drowned. It's called the epistotonic death posture, understood to be due to death by water. Numbers 23 through 26 concern the fossil record. I could do an entire session just on the fossil record. There's so much cool stuff about that. We would expect that the fossil record will reveal fully functional, distinct creatures whenever they appear in the fossil record, rather than evolving into something. That the fossil record would reflect the progression of the flood, that fossil anomalies to evolutionary thinking would be found, that fossil graveyards would be found, since this is occurring due to the flood, most of the fossil record. So looking at number 23, this prediction has been verified beyond a doubt in the fossil record. In fact, the term that evolutionists use to describe this phenomenon is called abrupt appearance. This is the term that Stephen Jay Gould, who's probably the leading evolutionary paleontologist of the 20th century, Harvard paleontologist, he said that, and this is not just weird anomalies, he says the whole fossil record from bottom to top, one of the characteristics of the fossil record is abrupt appearance. In other words, creatures show up abruptly without any evolutionary history. They're just, ta-da, here they are, as though they didn't evolve. And the biggest example of that is the Cambrian explosion, right there at the very base of the fossil record, where you have multiple phyla, very disparate body types, not just like a single body type, and then in the strata above them it gradually evolves. No, there's already very distinctive complexity and disparity among the fossils explodes onto the scene at the very bottom of the fossil record. Here's what Richard Dawkins said about this, famous evolutionary biologist of Oxford. The Cambrian strata of rocks, vintage about 600 million years, are the oldest in which we find most of the major invertebrate groups, and we find many of them already in an advanced state of evolution. They're already complex, they're not simple. The very first time they appear, it's as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history. Needless to say, this appearance of sudden planting has delighted creationists. Why? Well, because that's exactly what we'd predict to find. All right, the fossil record verifies creationist predictions. Numbers 24 and 25, evolutionary theory would predict that fossils in the lowest strata would be simpler, closer to that single-celled organism that everything supposedly came from. Now, trilobites are representative of the Cambrian strata because there's so many of them down there. And as you move up higher in the column, the fossil should, from an evolutionary perspective, become more complex as life is evolving towards human beings. So in the Bill Nye Ken Ham debate, Bill Nye even argued, hey, if you could find higher, more complex organisms mixing with your lower organisms, you'd change the world because you'd disprove evolution. Well, the truth is the trilobite is a very complex creature. It's considered one of the very first creatures to have evolved and therefore should be extremely simple, but it's very complex. The eye of the trilobite is equipped with aplantic lenses, so dual lenses, as opposed to the human eye that has a single refractive lens. Scientists acknowledge the design of the trilobite's eye is better than any other eye design. It allows it to see on the base of the ocean floor. And yet again, the trilobite is supposed to be primitive and simple, and it explodes onto the scene in the Cambrian explosion right at the beginning. So this is evidence against evolution. How about the fossil of a mammal with a dinosaur in its stomach? All right, mammals aren't even supposed to be around, mammals this big, with the dinosaurs. And yet here you've got mammals that have eaten the dinosaurs. By the way, this is in late flood sediment. Or the existence of so-called living fossils like the coelacanth, okay, where you've got a creature that's supposed to be ancient, extinct. They find it in strata that are supposed to be, say 100 million years old. And then all of a sudden, you don't find that in any of the layers above that. So presumably it went extinct. I mean, how could it not have been fossilized in 100 million years? And then all of a sudden, ta-da, we find the thing alive today. And guess what? It didn't evolve. It looks exactly like its fossil counterpart. There's dozens of these species like this. While the evolutionary model struggles to explain these kind of things, we'd predict them. We would argue that just because something's lower, it doesn't have to do with it being less complex. All kinds are created fully functional and perfect in the beginning. You'd expect a diversity of simplicity and complexity from the beginning. So whether or not a fossil is found lower is going to have to do with other factors, namely the burial progression of the flood. So if the flood again starts at the base of the ocean, you expect ocean floor critters, then the fish, and then the amphibians, and then the reptiles, and you start picking up the birds after that, as well as the mammals. It's exactly what we see happening as we look at the fossil record. Concerning number 26, fossil graveyards, clear examples of places where herds of animals are caught unable to escape a major cataclysmic fossil forming event, and these are found all over the world. I've already shown you the one I studied in Wyoming. Number 27, sedimentary rock is understood to be formed generally by bodies of water. And so if the flood occurred, you'd expect sedimentary rock to be found prevalently on the earth, and they are. They're the most common rocks, even exposed at the surface of the earth. They make up 75% of the surface rocks, even on mountains. But of course, in the flood strata, that is what they are. Other than places where igneous rock has come up from below, maybe during the flood or later, where you've had magma coming up, forming pockets of igneous rock. But the major strata are sedimentary. That's what you see when you go to Grand Canyon. Number 28, seismites will likely be found at the flood, and specifically catastrophic plate tectonics is true. So I've mentioned this a few times. So let me go ahead and just explain this a little bit more now. So if you have a sediment like, say, sand on a seashore and it's wet, if you were to, if an earthquake was to happen, it would shake that sand up. And as the water tries to get out of that sand, it will, if you were to then go ahead and lithify that sand, you were to compact it, get the water out of it, heat it up, have a cementing agent that's going to allow that to lithify before it messes up the structure. What it'll do is it'll show you, if you were to uncover that layer of rock, it looks all convoluted, convolutions, okay? It has what are called avulsion structures that are showing you what happened as the water was trying to escape the sand as it got shook up in the earthquake. So we can see these seismites all over the world and actually use it to correlate when earthquakes happen and stuff. So this isn't just some creationist idea. This is something in geology. Interestingly, creationists have gone over to like the Dead Sea and studied seismites there and been able to correlate seismites with biblical events, like Bible events that are mentioned where there's an earthquake. Like, earthquakes are mentioned whenever Jesus dies, right? There's various earthquakes throughout Bible history, and there's a creation geologists that have gone and shown how he showed the seismites that correlate with these biblical events. Pretty fascinating stuff. But when you have major earthquakes today, like 9.0 on the Richter scale, it will create these small seismites, few inches, where the sediments all shook up like that. Now, in Wyoming, we found seismites, but there's a catch. These aren't just a few inches. These are several feet in thickness. All right, now this is proof of huge amounts of water in Wyoming and enormous, unheard of earthquakes, multiple. There's at least 25 distinct seismite layers that we discovered up there. So based on catastrophic plate tectonics, this is the idea here is probably the Rockies are forming rapidly. And every time as these plates are smashing into each other, gradually forming the mountains, it's sending shock waves towards the end of the flood, creating these seismites. And by the way, this is the same place where we're studying dinosaur fossils. And so the dinosaurs are getting obliterated by the power of these seismites. I told you the dinosaurs we're looking at are in bits and pieces. It's as though they've exploded, like somebody, made them swallow a grenade or something. They're exploded. And so we find some of these dinosaur fossils sticking out of the seismites. Okay, so the power of these earthquakes are obliterating. And keep in mind, this is going on in the flood, right? So this is another way you can die in the flood, right? Is just the power of these earthquakes that are happening. So you picture this dinosaur. Have you seen those? You can watch some of these videos on YouTube where there'll be a camera looking at a plane, and you'll see an earthquake happen in the distance, and you'll see the whole earth like do a wave like that. It's not just the water; the actual ground will show you a wave from the earthquake. So you picture these dinosaurs, and you picture with these, kind of like earthquakes that probably throws them up and then crushes them, obliterates them into bits and pieces. And that's what's going on at the end of the flood with anything that's still alive. It's getting just totally shattered like that. Well, this is what you'd expect if the flood happened. Numbers 29 and 30, if the creation model is true and the incident of the Tower of Babel is true, you'd expect there to be evidence that event happened, once again, through historical evidence. So people passing down stories of the Babel incident. Do we see that? Sure we do. Just like with the flood, same thing with dinosaur legends, by the way. In the legend of the Toltec Indians, they tell of that flood that destroyed the first world, remember, 1,716 years after creation. The survivors of this flood left the chest, wandered the earth, and built a zaquali, a high tower, in case another flood came, and their languages were confused and they spread out. In the Miaotzu flood account, they have a flood legend where it poured for 40 days, and then there were 55 days of drizzle, and the flood covered the mountain ranges. Noah and his family and the animals were saved in a wide boat. A bird is sent out, sacrifices are made. The survivors made cities and spoke the same language, built a very high tower, which was wrong. God came and mixed their language. They didn't finish the city, and they were separated over the earth. Dan Landis documents other examples. In the Burmese legend, the people built a pagoda up to try to reach the heavens, and their God came down angrily and confused their languages, caused them to spread out. In the Congo, instead of building a tower, the people balanced themselves on big poles. In the Mexican version, they built a tower out of clay. In India, it was demons that build an altar to the sky and are thwarted by the sky god. Africa, Greece, the Assam people, many have this story about a structure being built into the sky and the language is being confused so that the people have to be spread out. And as with the flood legends, the details don't match, but they wouldn't be expected to match because the traditions are passed down orally for centuries. So if they did match, again, you'd expect that there might have been some kind of collusion in order for them to be so precisely matched like that. But this common thread of an incident involving God, a tall structure, and the confusion of languages is a common theme that would be predicted based on the flood model. All right, number 30, our last prediction, we'll cover actually in our last session. So, the creation model is certainly cannot make any verifiable predictions. We're just a bunch of ignorant hillbillies, and I don't know what you're doing wasting your time here. So, bottom line is Bill Nye and those like him are wrong. They're either ignorant unintentionally or ignorant willingly. Let's see, make sure these are, whenever I was doing that youth work in Texas, I was telling you that I like the idea of making sure our young people are ready to talk to other people, do evangelism. I feel like they're really kind of the front lines of the movement. And so I finally just made a list of about 250 passages or so that I really wanted young people to learn, to really memorize these and have them at the tip of their tongue. And it's a lot easier for kids to memorize this stuff using songs. So I've been writing hundreds of these songs for years now and have those available as CDs. Make sure you're aware that we have tons of material on our website, videos. We're constantly putting out new, even these short videos that are popular now with young people especially, that might be 3 to 6 minutes long, that just very quickly address some issue that they can hit real fast without it being a 30 to 45-minute lesson. But we have a lot of those on there as well. So be sure to check out our website to see any of that material as well. All right. Our schedule is so crazy. I don't know what's going on. We're just now supposed to be starting this session. So I guess I can just keep going for like another hour, right? Actually, we're supposed to do the Q&A next. Why don't we take 10 minutes and then we'll do the Q&A. We are nicely ahead of schedule though, so that'll be great. Thank you for your attention.
All right, everybody, it's time to take our seats. This is about the Q&A time. If you have a question, please raise your hand so that I can get the microphone to you and we can get your question answered. Does anyone have a question?
I'm going to ask you about the Ark. What types of investigations and everything are they doing in Turkey on Mount Ararat?
Okay. Can you hear me on here? First of all, while I'm thinking about it, let's see here. Okay, so disclaimer, I don't claim to have all the answers, but I will give it, what I'm going to do is give you answers from where I'm at in my studies, which are based on, I grant, a lot of study, but that doesn't mean that I'm right. So the location of the ark, so I think 3 different people might have asked me that. Where are we at on trying to find the ark? And so here is the problem with where everybody is searching for the ark today. They're searching for the ark on Mount Ararat, singular Mount Ararat. The ark landed in the mountains of Ararat. It immediately tells you there's a mountain range. Modern day Mount Ararat is guaranteed to not really be where the ark would be. And here's why we know that. Modern day Mount Ararat is a volcano that has erupted multiple times since the flood. Okay? You see the problem? And in fact is made of Cenozoic strata. Okay? So this is the flood strata here. So it's the material that's getting deposited in the flood. And the ark, keep in mind, comes to rest in the flood strata as the recession is just beginning. So there's continuing to be material being deposited. So if you were going to find the ark, it would be in strata that would be in here. They're looking in strata up here. Stuff that is Cenozoic material that came about after the flood. It would be way down below that if it was anywhere. So that is, to me, the biggest problem with where anybody's looking for the ark today. Now, there's other issues, just logically thinking through it. If you come off of the ark and imagine a world now where there's virtually no, everything's devastated. You don't even have, everything's dead, even trees, okay? And you need shelter, you need materials. What are you going to use? That ark is looking pretty good, especially when you start thinking in terms of what are people going to tend to do with this ark over time if it's left assembled? Yeah, they're going to tend to. In fact, remember the bronze rod, remember that the Israelites had, that the serpent on it ends up being turned into an idol and stuff? So if you're Noah's family and you know why this event had to happen, because of the wickedness of idolatry and everything going on, I would think it's going to be ever present on your mind, considering whether or not we should destroy this thing. Now, that didn't mean, we don't know for sure that it was, but I am thinking, okay, that makes it less likely. And now, and keep in mind, it's been 4,500 years about since this point too. So even if it wasn't at the time, interestingly, Josephus does mention, he tells a story that he heard that in, I think, Armenia, they talk about the ark still being there and people were carrying off pieces of it. He mentions that at his time, so about 2,000 years ago. Whether or not it was true, I don't know, but he mentions it and does highlight the fact that people are carrying pieces away of it, right, at that time. So you put all that together and you should be immediately skeptical of any of the supposed claims to have found it in this day and age. The biggest one being this issue about modern day Mount Ararat just cannot be the mountains of Ararat, that mountain range, whatever it is. Keeping in mind that the names of mountains and rivers and so forth have changed over these thousands of years. So the modern day river systems, you know, the Euphrates and Tigris and all that, you can't equate, for example, with what you read in Genesis 3 and 4, right? Genesis 3. All right, so that's kind of where we're at on that. That's about all that I can weigh in on that subject. By the way, as a corollary to that, what about the Tower of Babel? Have we found the Tower of Babel? That's another big question we all have. Now, here's the problem with that. Let me see if I can pull up another cool chart here. Okay, so when the flood ends, okay, so here is our main geologic column here. Precambrian is pre-flood. And interestingly, when you're using radiometric dating methods, okay, so using evolutionary dating methods to get the ages of rocks, okay, you know, you're at 0 up here, and as you go down, they get bigger. The flood where we think the flood ends, the rocks that that radiometrically date to 66 million years ago, those are the end of the flood. And as you keep going deeper, the rocks get older and older and older and older, keeping in mind that those aren't true ages because they don't take into account the accelerated decay that is going on in the flood. So you've got, say, 1 billion years worth of radiometric time in, it could be a month, right? So you have that kind of decay occurring that quickly. So it makes these rocks appear a lot older than they really are. But still, they're giving you at least what we call relative ages, meaning if a rock dates to 100 million years ago, it is probably older than a rock that dates 50 million years ago. It's not actually 100 million years old, but it is probably older than the other rock. Right? So that's what we mean by relative. And so the rocks get older as you go down. And you get down here and the rocks are dating to 541 million years, and then you jump across this line here. And all of a sudden, they're dating to 1.5 billion years in some cases. You've got like 1 billion radiometric years worth of time that's gone. That is the beginning of the flood. And there is this erosion surface here that's called, they call it the Great Unconformity. And it goes across the whole planet. You can see it at Grand Canyon. And it's this erosion surface where something happened that involved a lot of water, and it shaves off the top of the earth and erases all of this time, and then begins piling sedimentary rock layers above that. So you can see why this is obviously the beginning of the flood. Okay? Now, so you find the marine floor creatures, and as you go up, fish, and picks up the amphibians and reptiles and the dinosaurs up here with the birds, and then the flood ends, okay? Now, so the flood ends, we believe, at the base of the Cenozoic strata, okay? So that we interpret that as post-flood. All right, now let's go back to this guy. So this is the Cenozoic area blown up, okay? So now this is the end of the flood. Now, from a biblical perspective, right whenever they get off the ark, what would we expect to see in the fossil record? Well, the animals disperse because God told them to, right? And so you see that. You immediately see across the planet animals everywhere, but you still don't see any humans until you get up to here. Where are the humans at in these strata? Well, logically, for a period of time, they're only at Babel, right? So if you were going to find human fossils, that's where they would be. And we don't know where that is, right? And so you don't see any human fossils in any of these because they haven't spread out across the planet. Humans haven't spread out, right? So they're still in this one location, And if there isn't any catastrophic conditions there, they're probably not going to be fossilized. And all of a sudden, here in the Pleistocene, which by the way is the Ice Age, all of a sudden they radiate out from the Middle East, and you see the human fossils spread out from there. Okay, which tells you, where would Babel be in the strata? Well, you'd expect it at the base of the Pleistocene, because that's where the humans immediately spread out. Right? So Babel's got to be before that. It's below that in the strata. Well, guess where they're looking for Babel? They're looking in the Holocene. Nobody's looking in the right place. And the problem with this is the archaeologists don't understand paleontology. This is two different fields. The archaeologists are studying human artifacts. They're not looking at the fossil record. Okay, that's two different fields. So the creation paleontologists have shown, no, humans have already spread out in this whole area, so Babel's got to be here. And nobody's looking down there. There aren't archaeologists looking in the right place, right? So the answer is, have we found Babel? No, I don't think so. All right, that's still a mystery. And very possible that we can find that. Somebody's just got to look at the right place and look deep enough. You're basically got to look deeper in the strata to find that. Maybe more than you wanted to know, but fun topic. What else we got?
Okay, yeah, I actually have a couple questions. One, on the way evolutionists measure time in the billions of years. How are they attaching the billions of years when the way we measure time doesn't show up until billions of years after they've already started, because you have to have both the sun and the earth together fully formed so the earth could rotate around the sun to measure time as we measure time. But they've added billions and billions of years before we even get to that point. So what are they using to base any of that?
Okay, I'm not sure I totally follow what you're saying. So are you talking about people that would claim to be Bible believers?
No, evolutionists. So if they say
okay, so they would say the sun was around way before the earth. So
right,
they
but
would say
before the sun even got here, they're saying the Big Bang was...
How were they, still counting time?
Big Bang was however many billions of years.
Yeah, well, they're going with a solar year. They're using a solar year as their measuring point. Yeah. I see why you're asking that.
Without the sun?
Huh?
They're measuring it off a solar year without the sun.
Even though the sun's not there, they would still be using, I'm sure, the solar year to determine that. Yeah, interesting point. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they have a term for that in astrophysics, and I can't remember what it is at this point.
Okay. And then the other question I have, and I know the Bible doesn't say, but is there any thought to, from when creation happened on day 6 to the fall, how long that was?
Yeah.
And also, when God came down and gave the curse, he said women will have great pain in childbirth. And that seems to me that maybe they'd already had a child, because how would that be a curse if Eve had never had a child to even know what the difference was?
Okay, so you got a couple different questions there. First of all, let me pull up my logos here. All right, so your first question was, do we know how much time there was between when Adam and Eve were created and then basically the curse? So how long they were in the garden. So that's been used as an argument for, well, maybe Adam and Eve were in the garden for millions of years. Maybe that's where you squeeze the time, right, is whenever they're in the garden. All right, so the problems with that are, number one, again, in Genesis 1, we have the purpose of the stars. One of the purposes being given. One of the reasons God creates these is for humans, obviously, to be able to tell signs, seasons, days, and years. So we know that years are being counted from the beginning. And we know exactly how old Adam is when he dies. Okay, so you can't just throw in a bunch of time there before time starts being counted, because it's already being counted at the beginning. And one of the supporting evidences of that is see, it's not this one. This is important too, but okay. Notice here in Luke 11, Jesus makes this statement. The blood of all the prophets which was shed from the foundation of the world may be required of this generation, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah. So notice that Jesus is coupling Abel's death with the foundation of the world. Now notice the implications there. When does Abel die relative to the first sin? Well, it's after, right? Abel didn't die till after. And so were Adam and Eve there millions of years in the garden before that first sin? Well, if so, you'd have to say that Abel's blood was even after that, after millions of years, right? It was shed. But Jesus says, no, his blood was shed at the foundation of the world. You follow? So Abel had to have been killed quick enough where you would reason through, it was still at the foundation of the world. There hasn't been that much time between day 6 and long after the garden anyway. Now, another thing to reason through about this is God tells them in Genesis 1, 128. Yeah, okay. So he tells them to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, right? So they're supposed to be procreating, Adam and Eve. And if they didn't do that, that would have been the first sin, right? So they're already trying to procreate. And yet, if we understand what's going on in the text, Cain isn't born until after the first sin, right? And that is, so in other words, they're already out of the garden. So I would surmise that it hasn't even been 9 months when they get booted out of the garden, right? Assuming it's the same, if it's 9 months, right, in the pre-flood world, there's an assumption there. But so again, I'm not seeing, evidence of being able to squeeze a lot of time there in the garden. Now, what was your other question?
Well,
Can't
could they have
remember.
had kids before Cain, Abel, Seth? Because the curse says the women would bear children in pain. But if you've never,
Oh, yeah, your question
if you've
about
never done an event to even know there was pain involved or not, that wouldn't be a
Well,
relevant curse to me.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Now, there is some debate over what that means. Some have argued that it really might not be talking about the physical pain that comes with the actual birth process, because it seems to be describing everything that has to do with having children, right? The pain that comes with that whole thing. Because, in other words, things are going to be very different now. There's going to be a lot, because Cain goes that way, right? And Eve's going to bear a lot of pain over that,
So you're going
right?
from
As any mother would, huh?
So you're going from 18 years to worry about them to 400 or 500 years.
Right, yeah. So anyway, I've wondered whether that's what's going on. Us just tying it down to the actual labor process, I think we're constraining it more than I think what the text demands there. Yeah. Already done with questions and nothing else. And nobody wanted to ask me about the pre-flood human habitat. Everybody always wants to ask about that. So be it. All right, there you go. So isn't that interesting that, I've showed you how in the, all right, in the flood strata, as you're moving from the ocean floor onto land, you never get to the habitat that has the humans. What's going on there? Well, we can think about this. So first of all, from a theological perspective, let me step back a little bit. It's not just the humans that are missing. It's everything that would have to do with a human habitat. Okay, so like mammals, the larger mammals, they're not in the flood strata either, or the bulk of the angiosperm plants. That's stuff that we eat. So the fruit plants are not there. You have gymnosperm plants. That's pretty big out here out west, but that's not what the bulk of plants are today. It does seem to be what the dinosaurs must be eating, because that's what's found in that buried habitat. Any of the plants that are herbivores are apparently eating gymnosperms, right? So your pine kind of trees that are out this way and so forth. But the angiosperm plants are missing, the larger mammals, the bulk of the birds, and the humans. It's like one whole habitat is missing. You got to keep in mind that the flood seems to be burying the pre-flood habitats sequentially, as though the pre-flood world is organized by habitat more than it is today. Today it's all mixed up. But in the pre-flood world, there seems to be these different habitats that are being buried sequentially, and there's an entire habitat missing, right? And it's the one that would include the humans. And there's really no debate about that. Among the creationists, we all recognize we're missing the humans. What's going on there? Now, theologically, okay, if you're God and you want to destroy mankind and you don't want him repeating what he did to bring you to this point, do you want that civilization to be preserved in the rock record where archaeologists and paleontologists can study it? Right? We can dig down with archaeology and paleontology and learn a lot about ancient civilizations and the things they were doing. Many times really terrible things, right? And it kind of gives ideas to us. Now, what are they doing in the pre-flood world? Isn't it interesting? The Bible is really quiet about that. They're violent, and every intention is only evil. That's really all you get. The Bible's it's like it doesn't even want to give you any ideas. It doesn't want to give you any suggestions. Well, so theologically, you need to destroy that whole habitat. Now, you can't just take the humans. Otherwise, why do you even send the flood? Okay, just obliterate just the humans magically and do it. Well, he doesn't choose to do that. He chooses to use the flood. So now you've got to kill the humans and everything they live with. You need that entire habitat gone in order to do that. So how do you do that scientifically? Well, I would argue you could do it if the humans are at a subduction zone. Okay, so geologically, if you've got the human habitat at a subduction zone, then when the flood starts, they go into the mantle. And that's where they would be, a place you can't study. We can't get down there and study that. And I think we have biblical precedent for that, like in Numbers 15 with the incident of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. You remember that incident? Whenever those guys start usurping their authority and come at Moses, who do you think, we're all holy. Why are you taking it upon yourself to? And God's like, all right, everybody step back. And he opens up the earth and swallows Korah, Dathan, and Abiram and their families, right? In other words, it's a subduction zone. That would be the modern terminology for that. So I've wondered whether that's what's going on. Is some of that material that we see in the subduction zones is actually the pre-flood human habitat that's down there. And again, theologically, that would make sense. And it would actually be a show of God's grace, because that would have probably happened at the very beginning of the flood. Like humans wouldn't have been alive to see everything that goes on after that. You know, the animals deal with it, but the human habitat could have been obliterated off the bat. Isn't that interesting? Now notice it's all theoretical. I mean, we're just looking at the physical evidence and trying to reason through that, but we don't really know for sure, but I think it makes sense anyway.
Yes. We have records and we see that post-flood, we have mass grave sites, I guess you would say, of dinosaurs. We know many millions of people died in that flood also. Why isn't that replicated as far as human remains anywhere? I know what you were talking about, but that's I've always struggled with that thought of, we know they existed and walked the earth together. Why didn't they? I mean, I understand
Yeah.
what you said about they're swallowed up, and
Well, that's the key, because if they're not swallowed up, then they would have fossilized. You would see exactly what we see with the dinosaurs. You know, they're preserved. The dinosaurs were not subducted. That the only way that I can think of to totally eliminate the entire ecosystem is through subduction. Otherwise, you would have remnants of it preserved, and it seems to be totally gone. Now there are weird anomalies that'll pop up, or creationists are like, this looks like a human footprint, and it's over here with the dinosaurs. And I'll grant you, some of them are intriguing, but it's clearly not the human habitat. It's as though there's this lone human or something that somehow, you know, maybe was away from the human habitat whenever the flood begins, and so he's somewhere where he's not supposed to be, or not necessarily not supposed to be, but he's not with the humans, and he survives somehow. But the habitat, with all of their pre-flood technology and houses and archaeological artifacts, that's gone. And again, the only way I can think that you can do that is you got to get them into the earth itself, because otherwise there's going to be remnants. You know, keeping in mind that one of the things that's going on too in the flood, I didn't even talk about, there are these, we think that there were what are called gyres. Whenever the water of the flood got high enough where it's now over the land, we think that it would have created massive whirlpools, some possibly continent size, that were, tearing up the ground itself and causing cavitation, where you're breaking down the rock to particle size. So I mean, and yet even with that going on, you've still got fossils surviving. Like, we still see the dinosaurs and other critters all the way throughout the fossil record, but not the humans. And again, I don't know how else to get rid of them if not at a subduction zone. And again, I think that we have biblical precedent for that. I also found, I think it's in the Psalms, another allusion to what seems to be a subduction zone. Anyway, I find that interesting. Anyway, it's all very theoretical at this point. I don't know if we'd ever be able to get to a point where we can get down to the mantle and study that. Well, I mean, you know, yeah, from their perspective, they would probably say, oh, where's the human? And if we couldn't offer, I think, a legitimate explanation, I would say, okay, well, that's a good question. But they've got several of these kind of questions too. You know, like, here's one of the interesting things that the that the evolutionary community has to answer, that I think is pretty interesting. I don't know if I have a chart of this. You know, evolutionists argue that uniformitarianism is true. Okay, so whatever's going on today has always gone on in the past, and so they can't argue that there have been major things happening in the past that are not happening today. And yet they have to do that in order to explain the fossil record. Let me see if I can show you this here. Cracks me up. So I mentioned to you that the fossil record, there are three sweeping characteristics of the fossil record, according to evolutionists themselves. Abrupt appearance, that is, the creatures just show up without any evolutionary history leading up to them. And then the second one is called stasis. So the creatures abruptly appear, and then when you look in the strata above them, the creatures stay the same. They're stasis, they don't evolve. And then the third characteristic is extinction. Those are the characteristics. They abruptly appear, they don't evolve, and then they disappear. And on top, now, so you would expect from an evolutionary perspective for there to be extinction. You wouldn't expect abrupt appearance or stasis, that's already a problem, but you would expect extinction, but not mass extinction. Because mass extinction would indicate you got something big going on the planet that's wiping out huge amounts of species. That sounds more like the flood to me. So they can't argue for that. Now the problem is they have noted there's not just extinction, but there's mass extinction in the fossil record. They have pinpointed 5 different major extinction events that, according to their timeline, have existed in the past. In the Ordovician, so down here, 60 to 70% of species go extinct for some reason, and they don't even have an explanation as to how or why. And yet that alone already shows you uniformitarianism doesn't work. They're catastrophic, just like we are. In fact, they're more catastrophic than we are, because they believe in 5 different extinction events. We only believe in one. The Devonian, 75% of species go extinct. The Permian, 95% of species. 70 to 80% of the species here. And then finally the Cretaceous, the one that they think that they might know would have happened there, a big meteorite off the coast of Mexico, but it's got its own problems as well. But notice, they believe in catastrophism more than we do, and yet they don't really even know what would have caused any of these. They got no explanation. Now, can you tell what's going on? Like, how would we interpret this? Like, really what's going on is, what they're saying is, when you look at the fossil species that exists down here, and all of a sudden at this line, 60 to 70% of those guys disappeared. You don't see them anymore in the layers above. That's what they mean by that. So in the Devonian extinction, okay, well now they look at these guys here. All of a sudden, when you cross this line, 75% of them don't show up above that anymore. All right, and you keep doing that. So how would we interpret that? What's really going on there? Well, we would say is this is marking the edge of various habitats. All right, so whenever the flood finishes wiping out this habitat, most of those species aren't going to be found above them because those are in different habitats, except, for example, certain fish species, marine species, you would expect them to be in the layers above them, which sure enough is a lot of the 30 to 40%, 25%, 5% that continue to show up in the layers above them. But a huge percentage, for some reason, just disappear from the planet. Again, we've got a good explanation. What's theirs? They literally don't have anything, right? Now, yeah, granted, we're like, okay, well, how come the human habitat's not there? It's gone. But again, I can give theologically why that would be predicted to be the case. Like we would make that prediction and then go out there and not find it, and it would make sense. And I could give, again, even the mechanism for how you would do that. And I feel like that's all we need. Now, this is not to say that creationists have every answer sorted out on this. I'm not claiming that. I think there's a lot of things God wants us to dig in and find answers to. What I tell young people, whenever they hear things that, oh, I don't know how to deal with that. Always fall back on what you do know. Okay, if they bring up some quibble, okay, whatever the quibble is, does it disprove all the evidence we've looked at for the existence of God? No. I mean, none of that's been touched. Does it disprove all the evidence we've looked at that demands the inspiration of the Bible? No, they haven't disproved that. So fall back on what you know. Whatever interesting point they bring up, it doesn't disprove the things that we've already established as being true. All it is some interesting question that we need to figure out what's going on. Go study it. There's nothing to be afraid of. There's going to be some legitimate answer. We just got to figure out what it is. For an example, one of the big questions creationists are trying to figure out, when I went to a session at one of our creation conferences where the presenter was just calculating how much heat is being released by what we're saying happened in the flood. I mean, when you add the meteorite activity going on, and you add all the volcanic activity and the entire ocean floor being overhauled, this is an enormous amount of heat. You've got accelerated nuclear decay going on, where you've got 1 billion years of radioactive decay happening in a short amount of time. This is a lot of heat, like enough to probably virtually maybe vaporize the ocean. I mean, this is an enormous amount of heat. And creationists are busily at work trying to figure out what's going on with this. What's the explanation? But regardless of what the explanation is, it's not a blind faith to say, oh, well, this doesn't disprove the Bible. No, because the Bible stands on its own. It already has authenticated itself as demanding that it comes from God. That doesn't change. So we know the flood happened. It's just a question that God wants us to study. The works of the Lord are great. And every time we come up with a new question, we're like, wow, how do we explain this? Which incidentally, one of my interns, I have an intern program for young people in particular interested in going into the sciences. And he was wanting to do geology. He came and did 3 different internships with me. And one of the questions that I prepared him for is this heat problem. And sure enough, his first geology class when he was down at University of Florida, the geologist professor was like, oh, these creationists, a bunch of hillbillies. And he proceeded to state the flood heat problem. Well, they can't explain. I mean, the flood couldn't have happened because the amount of heat they're saying, oh, come on. To which, again, what has he done? What has he proven? Has he disproved God by saying that? No. The classical arguments still continue to stand. Has he disproved the inspiration of the Bible? No, that continues to stand. So all he's done is brought up this interesting question that we're studying. I remember one of the things I told you is, you got to be careful about just saying, well, God just did it. I think you got to be careful about that, because that can lead to laziness. We need to make sure that we study this out. What is going on here? What does God want me to study to figure out what's going on? But if the context demands a supernatural explanation, then it is justified in suggesting that God may have done it. Notice here in the middle of the flood incident what Moses tells us. God remembered Noah and every living thing and all the animals that were with him in the ark, and God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters subsided. All right, now, thermal science was one of the things I studied in school, and there's 3 ways to have heat transfer, and one of the good ways to do it is through convection. And this is not a normal, and that's a convection, by what we mean by that is like wind. Wind cools things off. But this is not a normal wind because God himself makes it, right? So here we have a textual clue that I think tells us there really is probably no natural explanation to that, how you handle the heat problem in the flood. God himself gets involved in this process of heat generation. But it requires you to go, study the Bible, think about that, like the implications of what Moses is saying. I just find that so fascinating that here's Moses writing in 1446 BC, and he'll just make these little allusions like that, as though he's anticipating things thousands of years later, a little clue that you need to have in order to answer some new issue that people bring up. I mean, I run across that kind of stuff all the time, and it always just blows my mind, but it requires digging in to find these kind of answers. Anyway, that's way more than you wanted to know. But
I had a question. You mentioned Numbers 15 and a passage in Psalms. Do you have the Psalms chapter verse that you were
oh
referring
man,
to?
okay, I'm gonna have to look that up tonight. But
Okay.
so I have to figure out where that was, and it's not Numbers. Let me double check on that. Where's Kor Dathan Abiram? Maybe number 16. Yeah, it's number 16, Kor Dathan Abiram. But I'll have to find that other passage. I can't remember where that is.
Thank you. In addition, can you give me an approximation of how deep each of those layers are?
It depends upon where you are, okay, on the planet. In some places, you'll see these layers and they'll thin out and kind of maybe disappear in one area, and then all of a sudden they'll thicken back out and show up somewhere else. So you see that in this neck of the woods too. Some of the layers that are at Grand Canyon will thin out and you won't see them other places, and vice versa. There'll be layers elsewhere that you'll see in the strata, and all of a sudden they thin out when you get to the Grand Canyon, and the rest are there, but one's missing. So it just kind of depends on where you are. But down here at this unconformity that's missing, I told you there's like 1 billion radiometric years missing there. So when you're at the Grand Canyon, you're standing at basically right here. And at the Grand Canyon, it is a mile from here down to here of sediment. And there's about a mile above you that's totally missing. And you have to go up the Grand Staircase to find it, right? Y'all know what the Grand Staircase, you're from Arizona. No? So go on to the north side of Grand Canyon and start keeping on going to the other parks, Zion and Bryce and so forth. Well, you continue to see the strata go further up. Let me see if I can find a... Oh, wait, I know where I can get. All right, where's that chart? Ah, here we go. All right, so this chart right here is valuable in showing you what I'm getting at here. So at here's Grand Canyon over here. And so when you're standing on the rim, you're actually on the top of the Kaibab limestone right there. And you're looking down a mile of sediment. And the Colorado River is basically right in here. You get to see the great unconformity that goes across the whole planet where the flood begins. And then this down here is, well, right across here, you have 1 billion years worth of material that's just missing, radiometric years. And keeping in mind that this from here to here is only about, say, 250 million radiometric years. That's a mile. You're missing like 4 times that at the great unconformity. There may be 4 miles of sediment that are totally obliterated by the flood. But then you've got a whole nother mile above this that's been eroded away during the recession. And again, you got to go to other places in Arizona to see it, which this chart shows you. So if you jump over to Zion Canyon, it starts at Kaibab at the bottom, and then it goes on up through the layers that above it. I've found seismites, massive seismites in the Navajo sandstone. Okay, and then you've got a key, and by the way, notice here now we're in, the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous sediment. This is all that big pink section I was showing you. This is where there's dinosaurs, right? Okay, you probably remember Jurassic Park, right? So Zion takes you up through the Carmel Formation, and then if you go over to Bryce Canyon, it'll start down here and keep going up even higher. So you get this staircase where you get a huge chunk of the geologic column by just jumping from place to place. And you'll get some overlap, and then it keeps going on up. In this one, at Bryce Canyon, you actually get to see the end of the flood and then the beginning of tertiary sediment, which is post-flood. Now, this is a huge amount of the geologic column in this grand staircase, but there are missing strata in there that are found elsewhere where you did have deposits that are still huge. They, for whatever reason, are not over here in Arizona, and so they thin out in places. And so it's complicated, to figure out what all's going on there. If you've seen the movie Is Genesis History, raise your hand if you've seen that. I'm curious about that. Somebody I know has. Somebody told me that they saw it. I highly recommend it. Those are the leading creation scientists, and those are the guys that I go study with in the field and go to creation conferences with and so forth. And they put out a movie called Is Genesis History. It was in theaters a few years ago. One of those 1 or 2 night kind of special things. If you haven't seen that, you need to check that out because this is a bunch of PhD scientists laying out for you, and I think a very eloquent way that you can still understand, though, a lot of information, particularly that's very relevant to you over here in Arizona. And there's a sequel to that, too, that they've developed now. Very tempted to tell you about it because it's so cool. I got to tell you about it. Because this is such a cool story. Down in the Grand Canyon, the very first strata that's formed as the flood begins is called the Tapeats Sandstone. Okay, I don't know if you've heard of that name, Tapeats Sandstone. It's not a funny name. Down there in those strata, we have folded strata, like at Carbon Canyon, which is that Grand Canyon, and this one is too. You've got, notice these strata that bend. You can barely see, there's a human right there. It shows you how big this is. This is at the beginning of the flood. Now, one of the principles of geology is called the principle of horizontality, and that is like if you were to take a melted milkshake of, say, Rocky Road, which is the best kind, and you pour it out, okay, it's going to lay out horizontally, right? And so the principle of horizontality in geology says that originally when strata are formed, they're horizontal, okay? So if they're bent like this, it indicates something happened after they were deposited to bend them, okay? That's what you infer from that. By the way, you can see another little person right there. Okay, and so these are obviously bent. Again, we would say at the beginning of the flood. All right, so you picture all the fountains of the Great Deep are bursting forth. You got tectonic activity that's moving mountains, moving strata and so forth. And now, how do you bend? Like what happens if you try to bend a rock? It breaks. It doesn't bend, right? That's the point. And yet here we have strata that are bent and they're not broken, which implies they weren't rock when they got bent rapidly, which means all this material was deposited and it was still not lithified. Something has to have happened to bend it while it was still soft and malleable. Now we can explain that great with the flood. That's powerful evidence of the flood. Now, secular world says, well, it could have metamorphosed. You could take sedimentary rock, put it under a lot of heat and pressure and bend it slowly, and it'll metamorphose, it'll allow you to bend it without breaking it. And so that's what's going on at Grand Canyon. That's what they say. but nobody had ever gone in and taken samples of the strata at these bend points to see, are they metamorphic or sedimentary? I mean, this is just science. You can just easily go do these samples and test it. So Andrew Snelling, who's a great creation geologist up at Answers in Genesis, he applies for a pass with the National Park Service, a permit to be able to go and get samples at these places at Grand Canyon. And they reject him because he's a creationist. So Answers in Genesis sues the National Park Service and wins. And he's able to go in, get the samples, and prove it is sedimentary rock. Exactly as creationists would predict. Huge evidence of the flood and a major problem for the secular model. So the sequel to the movie Is Genesis History is giving that story. It's called Mountains After the Flood. And so I highly recommend it too. So they're very good stuff. Now, Is Genesis History, they actually sent that movie to me to preview, to make sure that I was okay with it, so that I would be willing to promote it to Churches of Christ. And I had some things that I wanted tweaked in there, which they changed. They tweaked it before they put it out in theaters. So I feel really good about the movie Is Genesis History, and Mountains After the Flood's really good too. So I highly recommend those, that you take a look at those. Oh. Someone 11, 2. Maybe that does sound familiar. No, that's not the one I was thinking about. Nope. I'll keep looking. What else we got?
Is there any new evidence or current things going on right now that you haven't told us in all of this?
Other kind
Any
of modern,
studies?
cool evidences? Oh,
Uh-huh.
yeah. Good question. Let's see, other up and coming things. There's so much. I'm going to try to give you the coolest ones that I can think of. Let's see here. I got a picture of this. Okay, my wife just texted me and said where she's at in Hawaii. There's a volcano erupting right now that there's a live feed of that I'm missing because I care about you all. Yes, the Big Island. Okay, so I can't figure out where that picture is, so I'll just tell you about it. Actually, wait a minute. I see it. Okay, look at this here. This is a picture, like if you were to go down at Grand Canyon, if you were to go down the South Kaibab Trail into the Grand Canyon, you'll come down into the Coconino Sandstone and you have these cross-bedded strata. Okay, and this is thought to be from the secular interpretation of this is, oh, well, these are ancient desert sand dunes. Okay. And what creationists have said, no, I mean, see, these desert sand dunes take a long time to accumulate. This would be evidence of a lot of time. But we're saying all this is deposited quickly in the flood. Well, creationists have made the point that you find sand dunes formed underwater too that are called sand waves, right? As water's moving over sand that's underwater, it'll form dunes too, but they're different than Aeolian sand waves. Aeolians are the wind-deposited sand waves. So there's a geologist up at Cedarville University that's been taking his students all over the place down here, Grand Canyon and surrounding areas, studying the sandstone layers and getting dip angles to see what the angles are on all of these sand dunes, or all these dunes, to see if they match the angles of Aeolian deposited sand dunes, and he has showed unequivocally these are not sand dunes. We don't know for sure what they are. We think they're sand waves, but that's another study that he has to do. But he has shown, I think, he's nailed down the fact that these are not desert deposited dunes. They're something else, and so that just suggests that they're sand waves. That's a pretty cool study going on, but there's an even cooler one. I talk about this in Flooded. What is that? Well, okay, so when you study, evolutionists have tried to use mitochondrial DNA to try to prove humans have been around for 180,000 years, Homo sapiens. And whenever you dig into the literature on that and figure out what they're doing, they're using circular reasoning. They're basically like, okay, let me step back a little bit. Mitochondrial DNA, both a dad and mom contribute DNA into the nucleus of the child. But only moms generally contribute DNA to mitochondria in a fetus. So what they've tried to do is look at mutation accumulation in mitochondria and try to calculate backward to a point where there was no mutation and figure out how long that would be to get you to the point where Eve lived. And they've said it's 180,000 years. Well, you look into the calculations, you find out they're not actually using a real mutation rate. Like they're not looking at how fast do mutations actually accumulate in the mitochondria. Instead, they're starting with the evolutionary assumption and figuring out exactly how many mutations would have to occur to get you back there. When you use the actual mutation rate of mitochondrial mutation, it actually points you back to 3 populations of people that lived about, I can't remember if it was, I think it's actually 4,500 years ago, right? That separate because of some thing that happens, right? Which fits, of course, with Babel, right? You got the Shem, Ham, and Japheth groups, and the mitochondrial DNA is actually supporting this. And they've done the same thing, creationists have done the same thing with Y chromosomes in dads, and have been able to trace back and show that Adam had to have lived within 10,000 years using actual mutation rates rather than circular reasoning that the evolutionists are using. So this is very also up and coming research that creationists have been doing. Oh yeah, there's one other one I forgot about. Creationists have been, there's a creation geneticist by the name of Jeffrey Tompkins at the Institute for Creation Research in Dallas. And he's been doing research looking at, you've probably heard the numbers where people will say, humans and chimp DNA is like 98 to 99% similar. You heard this? Like we're 98 to 99% related. Which, by the way, I think is interesting because when you actually look at the numbers, you find that male humans are more related to chimps than they are actually to female humans. What it does is it highlights, it really just depends upon how you look at these numbers, right? But what Jeffrey Tompkins did is he got into these comparisons to see what's going on. Are we actually 98 to 99% identical to chimps? And what he found is they're only comparing the sections where there are similarities between humans and chimps. And you start taking everything else into account, it brings the number down to like 80%. All right, so pretty big. Now, he's been doing this for years. Just this year, the secular community has now come out with their own recalibrated numbers, and it verifies what creationists have been saying for years, our own studies of this. So that was huge. That's another huge thing. Another interesting thing, the James Webb Telescope. So this is in the area of astrophysics, right? So we're trying to cover a lot of different areas here. In the area of paleontology, you have the dinosaur fossil soft tissue that's been discovered. We looked at genetics now. We've looked at things in geology. And now let's look at, in the area of astrophysics, when the James Webb Telescope went up, it's been a couple years now. Y'all know what that is, James Webb Telescope? No? Okay, fancy new telescope that they put up in space that can see stuff even further away than we've ever been able to see. Now, theoretically, what you're seeing is stuff that is further back in time. Okay? Because if that light traveled to us at what we think the speed of light is, and there's a lot I could say about that too, but what we think the speed of light is, then the farther away you're seeing things, then the farther back in time you're seeing, right? You're seeing light from events that happened that much further back. Now, Big Bang predictions are such that you wouldn't have these fully mature galaxies that have come about after the Big Bang until at least 1 billion years after the Big Bang. Well, the James Webb Telescope, they're all excited about it because now we're going to be able to see these galaxies that are formed 1 billion years after the Big Bang and actually see whether they're really mature or not. Well, excitingly, they're able to see stuff even further back. It's only 300 million years after the Big Bang. And guess what? They're already fully mature. They're already like big and beautiful and up and running. So it, once again, and this has happened many times, Big Bang predictions fall short, falsifying the theory. But of course, they're not going to accept that, right? Instead, you got two options. What are you going to do? Anybody know? What are your two options that you can do if you're a blind believer in the Big Bang? What are you going to do? Believe it anyway. Well, how are they going to adjust their model to account for this? I mean, you got to explain how a galaxy can be up and running in 300 million years instead of 1 billion years, so 1,000 million years. Telescope, okay, so initially they were thinking maybe that's it, we got to verify this, but now they feel like it's verified, so they're like, I don't know what to do with it. What are they going to do? You got two options. Something's wrong with their math? Well, they don't want to say that. Something else was created out there? Well, no evidence of any explosion or anything. They don't want to say that. Anybody? Huh? Give up. Hey, well, thankfully, a lot of Big Bang cosmologists have thrown in the towel on the Big Bang and have backed away from it. It's true. But that's not what the bulk of them are doing.
Any previous knowledge?
Disavowing any previous knowledge. No, they either have to say, oh, well, I guess back to the drawing board, apparently galaxies can form that fast. Okay? Apparently, instead of it taking 1 billion years, there must be a way for it to create itself in 300 million years. Okay, so that's one of your options. Or make the universe older. I guess it's not 13.8 billion years. We're going to have to add more onto it, which is what they've been doing forever. If we can't explain how it could happen, well, just throw more time at it. Because, you give it enough time, it's going to happen. Anything. In fact, they'll say anything will happen given enough time, as long as it doesn't have a probability of 0. They'll say things like that. Just got to keep throwing time at it. It doesn't matter how ridiculous it is. They'll still say it can happen.
given that the education system is against you, given that the finances are against you,
You mean me personally?
no, the
Because that's true.
well, I'm just talking about creationism. Those who want to who are working with creation versus evolution. Everybody wants evolution to be correct, and they don't want creation. Not everyone. But what is the strategy of combating all of this knowledge that is law
Mm-hmm.
of nature?
Welcome to my job. I mean, that's my job, to figure out ways to combat this in every way we can. You know,
Okay.
we got to just get the word out there. That's this. We got to be knowledgeable enough to be able to give people answers to these things. I believe, to convince people. All of us, and this isn't just AP guys. All of us have to be able to take this information and disseminate it. You know, as much as we can.
Is there something you can do with the Department of Education to where they will?
You mean the government? Get involved with the government? Yeah, we already answered that.
I mean, I'm wondering if getting rid of the Department of Education is a benefit to you.
Yes, it would be. Yeah, I mean, leaving it up to the states,
Yeah,
a lot of states would still be very friendly to
yeah.
the
Getting rid
kind
of
of
the
things that
department,
we want to teach.
that
Yeah,
would be one thing.
yeah. I mean, Department of Education has, put a stranglehold on a lot of, I think, the information.
And the
that we
teachers
could
union.
present. Yeah, probably so. I don't know as much about them, but are there teachers in here that'd be very offended by what we just talked about?
And the other thing, when you were talking about what was in Wyoming, is that similar to the National Monument?
In what way?
How it's in the layering of it.
You mean where it's found in the layers?
Yeah.
Okay, so you mean like how they formed? No.
I'm actually talking about
Oh.
that one thing. Is that what it
looks like
in other places?
At Dinosaur National Monument, there are more articulated dinosaurs there than what we're seeing in Wyoming. Yeah. And so they're not as near the blast zone, I think, over there as they're a little bit further away. So they're getting obliterated probably by the same. I mean, so Dinosaur National Monument is also up very close to where I was studying in the geologic column. It's close to the Lance Formation. It's called something different in Utah. That's where Dinosaur, I think, National Monument is. They call it something different, that formation, but it's up there at the very top of the Cretaceous. It's where the dinosaurs are getting wiped out at the very end. But as I recall, that's further away from really kind of where that blast zone is. So they're getting killed, but not as obliterated as what I'm seeing in Wyoming. But I haven't done a full study of all of the beds, over there to see what's going on there.
Okay. Yeah, I thought another question when you brought up the space. I don't know how to totally articulate this, but other than just when we look in the sky and it's pretty and, we're one of 8 or 9 planets, depending on what you want to do with Pluto. What is the purpose of the planets in our solar system? Because he could have just created just us. We'd just be floating around by ourselves, but we have all of this company. Do those planets somehow have positive impact on ours, other than just they're pretty
Other
to
than
look at in the
just
sky
beauty?
or whatever?
That can get, it's a very complicated question. So the big answer is that this whole universe was created to be, the terminology that Thomas Warren used, a veil of soul making. Really the whole purpose of everything. Everything that is here in the universe is here to help us to create an environment that will be conducive to preparing us for the afterlife and making that decision. Okay, so that's the big answer to everything. That explains so many things. But when you start getting into the nitty gritty, okay, what is the purpose of cockroaches? Why did God create cockroaches? Well, now it gets complicated, 'cause you got to look at every interaction that the cockroach makes with the earth that could somehow play into that ultimate purpose. And I feel the same way about the stars. Now, what he comes out and tells us, that these stars are useful for us for telling sign, season, days, and years, which means that's important to God that we be able to do that. I think that's an interesting thing. And planets can be useful to that. But, that's a way bigger question than that. There are some, stars and galaxies that we didn't even know existed until the James Webb Telescope could see them. And so from that I get, well, some of it is just showing us the infinitude of God. There's a really cool video. You can see it for free online if you just YouTube. It's on YouTube, but you can see it at the planetarium at the Creation Museum, and it's called Created Cosmos, and I highly recommend it. It really shows you the vastness of the universe, everything we know about it, and it shows you. It's humbling because it shows how inconsequential we are in one sense compared to the vastness of the universe. But then it enlightens passages that say things like, what is man when I consider your work, what is man that you're mindful of him? Like you don't really get that until you do a study of the stars. I feel like that study makes you go, oh, yeah, why would you do that? Why did you choose to put on flesh and come here for us when we're smaller than cockroaches, really? I mean, we're just nothing. And I think that's an important message, right? That the humility. I did an 18-lesson series at our congregation on pride, how much the Bible has to say about this. It is the Bible has, it's one of the main, I think, themes of the Bible is the importance of humility. And if you study the stars, that should be one of the things you get out of it, is it humbles you with the power of God, the size of God, the knowledge of God, the power of God, and how insignificant we are. And yet the fact that God chose he deemed to select us to give any attention to. But I'm sure there's a lot of other things we could say about it, why he did what he did up there. I know this, it's really cool. And one of the things you learn about creation biology is, what am I supposed to learn about God by studying creation biology? One of the things I learned about God is he likes variety. Think about that. Like God could have created everything to basically look the same, and he didn't. Everything is different. And he even does it in space too. He likes variety. I think that's fascinating and worth pondering. Like, what's that about? What's the spiritual impact of that, and so forth? And I think it helps us to get our mind around infinity more. But anyway, that's a conversation that would take an infinity amount of time probably to.
You were going to mention something about aliens, you said.
Aliens.
You
Ooh.
said you were going to say something about aliens, and I know that's people are, always they tell me we're going to have aliens here. Well, my dad told me that God has a plan of salvation for us here.
Yeah.
And nothing is he wouldn't let anything happen to change what he created.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just wondering what you were going to say.
Okay, we'll talk about aliens for a minute. Where's Area 51? It's New Mexico, right? Nevada, that's Nevada? Okay. Okay, so first of all, the alien issue is one of the proofs that the Big Bang did not occur. They call it the Fermi paradox, F-E-R-M-I, the Fermi paradox. And the idea is, if the Big Bang is true, if the universe is as old as they say it is, then it is inconceivable that life did not spring into existence and evolve somewhere else to a higher state of evolutionary development than us. And it should have long ago come to our neck of the woods and explored. And yet there is no actual evidence of that ever happening. And so they call it the Fermi paradox. And it is a falsification of the Big Bang. It is impossible that there's not aliens out there from their perspective, and we should have already seen it. And it's not there. It's as though the earth is kind of special. And so that leads into what the leading cosmologists call the anthropic principle. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Don't let me forget. So back to aliens for a minute. Now, from a biblical perspective, I would argue that I think there are theological issues if you argue there are other sentient beings that would have souls like us elsewhere. Because, yeah, I mean, the earth it was created first. And it was to earth that God's going to send Jesus. That would be, showing pretty major favoritism to create other beings with souls elsewhere that are kind of an afterthought or something. Now, that said, is it possible that there are other life forms out there that are not sentient, animal, plant kind of stuff? I don't know. I don't feel like I can speak definitively about that. I feel confident we can say there's not actual other sentient beings that would be more intelligent than us. Again, I think you got problems with that, but who's to say what else is out there for us to discover? God, he seems to want us to be able to discover things, keep digging. Not just off in the distance with telescopes, but even under microscopes. We keep finding stuff that's even smaller that exists. Again, it just shows this infinite nature of the Creator. We can't look far enough in any direction without seeing evidence that he's there. That's why it is without excuse for us to argue that he's not there. Now, this anthropic principle, we're talking about other cool things going on that I think are more recent evidences. This just blows me away. This is actually in my book, Science versus Evolution. I put this in an appendix back there. And the leading naturalistic, atheistic cosmologists, they can't help, as they study the universe, they can't help but see evidence of design. Okay, now I read too much of their material, okay? I mean, I'm telling you, so many different magazines I can't even remember every month that I'm plowing through, where I can look for quotes of their leading guys and report it. And their leading cosmologists, they are more eloquent in articulating evidence in the universe of a designer than I am. Okay, it's like they're ripping their hair out because of the powerful evidence in the universe that demands, not only does the universe appear designed, it appears to be designed specifically for humans on this planet. So that's why they call it the anthropic principle, from anthropos, for man. Okay, and so that's what they call the anthropic principle. It's like the universe seems to be just right for humans in particular. So what are they going to do with this? So Bernard Carr, who's a cosmologist at Queen's Mary University over in London, he waxes eloquent about the design of the universe. And then he goes, if you don't want God, you'd better have a multiverse. Okay, so their only way to explain the powerful evidence of God in the universe is to postulate the multiverse. In other words, we don't just live in a universe. There must be many other universes out there, and we just happen to be in the perfect one. Okay, that's basically the argument. If there's an infinite number of universes, then at least one of them is going to happen to be just right for us. That's the argument. All right, now to his credit, Paul Davies over here at Arizona State, he's like, now wait a minute. You see any problems with this, guys? Even if that were the case, you still need somebody to create the multiverse, right? That's one big problem. But there's a bunch of other problems. I go through like 7 different problems on this. And one of the problems is they come out and say, these universes, you could never know that they exist. They're unobservable and always will be unobservable. It doesn't matter how far technology evolves. In other words, it is not science, right? Because science, according to their own definition, has to be observable and so forth. It is a pure blind faith. Remember, this whole debate is not about the evidence, right? It is about a willingness to accept the implications of the evidence. They want to point the finger at us and say we have a blind faith, and they're, wait a minute here. Who's got the real blind faith here? Interestingly, I've in the article I talk about, I give a ton of quotes where they say, they're excited about this multiverse idea, which, by the way, literally came out of the comic books. But seriously, it's where it came from. There's no actual science that can support this, right? It's totally made up idea. But the idea is, okay, maybe if there's something outside of the box besides God, then it could be what put the stuff in our universe, right? That's really what they're trying to do. But they don't want to make it God. Oh, why would you not want to make it God? Well, maybe because there's expectations if you do that. You don't like something he's requiring you to do. Well, anyway, so they say in this multiverse, anything that can happen happens because there's an infinite number of these universes. In fact, you live in other universes carrying out identical lives with other yous everywhere because this is just infinity. Anything that can happen, happen. All right, now my question is this. Is it possible that God exists in one of these universes? Well, yeah, because anything possible is going to be in one of the universes. Well, that means God does exist then. And if he's omnipresent, it means he exists here too. So the multiverse idea still proves God. They'll keep pushing the goalposts back as far as they can, but that's not changing the facts. It doesn't matter what you do. Even the leading cosmologists are just having to rip their hair out because they don't want God, but he is everywhere. You can't deny it. The heavens declare the glory of God, and they're recognizing that. But they just blindly ignore it anyway. It's irrational. One of the big things I try to do when I'm dealing with naturalists, the single seed that I want to plant, because most of these young naturalists, like I was doing a seminar with other creation scientists at the Jacksonville congregation in Alabama and Jacksonville State University, their atheist group came over. And so after our sessions, they came over to spar with a bunch of the scientists. So we were kind of broken up into groups sparring with some of their students. And the president of their club, I was sparring with him a little bit. And so there was one single point that I really wanted to make. Because these young people, they have been told that they're the rational ones. They base everything on evidence. And you don't have evidence for God because you can't taste, touch, hear, smell, or see God. So we're rational and you guys are ignorant hillbillies. And it's okay. It's okay. One day you'll be as smart as us. And we base everything on actual empirical evidence. You guys don't. So the big point that I'm trying to make to them is, wait a minute, you don't even realize that's not true about yourself. And so I asked this young man, I said, so do you believe at some point life had to come from non-life? Yeah, life had to, it was, in the Miller-Urey experiment in 1950s, whenever okay, but he didn't actually create life. Well, yeah, it was more like tar that he created. Yeah, well, but he created the building blocks. Okay, fine. He created some of the building blocks. Okay, so he created the bricks. All right, now how do you get the building out of that? Well, and I said, no, wait a minute, but you believe life can come from non-life, even though it's never been done before in nature. Well, yeah, but if you strike, with lightning, a pool, and all right, now wait a minute. Has this ever been able to happen in a laboratory or anything? Well, no. And I said, no, wait a minute, you still believe it. And he sat there and he was like, another one of those moments where he was like, how did that not dawn on him? So he's been so fed this garbage from the professors and so forth, it had not occurred to him. He's the one with the blind faith, not me. That blew him away. He started going, I guess we do have something of a faith. I think the way he worded it was, well, I guess we all have faith. And I said, we don't have a blind faith. That's not what we have. I'm following the evidence. That evidence demands God exists, and the Bible is His Word. I've got a foundation for what I believe. You have nothing, and you believe it anyway. That is a pure blind faith. Now, you can do that if you want. That's your choice. But you just don't delude yourself into thinking you don't have a blind faith. You're being irrational. You are drawing conclusions that are not warranted by the evidence. So, you at least need to face that about yourself. If you just want to continue to blindly believe that, fine. But don't dignify it and look down at creationists as though we're the ignorant hillbillies here. That's not what's going on. Anyway, that's like the one seed that I try to plant in these guys, because I can tell they're so arrogantly thinking that they're standing on this evidence, and they don't realize it's the exact opposite. You got to imagine the devil's just sitting back going, you got to imagine. He is great at deceiving people, deluding them into believing all kinds of crazy things. Another question.
Jeff, I was wondering why there aren't any humanoid fossils from the pre-flood era.
In the pre-flood.
Pre-flood, yes.
All right, so I showed you why there wouldn't be in the flood. So what's going on with the pre-flood? Let's see here. Get back to my illustration there. Okay, so I believe what's going on there, well, you got two things going on. Number one, these strata that are missing, that is a huge chunk of the surface of the pre-flood world that's totally obliterated there. It's just gone. It's been eroded to particle form. But remember that the pre-flood human habitat, the whole thing, apparently was maybe subducted. That's what I've theorized there. That entire habitat with the mammals and angiosperms, it's gone down in the mantles. That would be where you'd have to find it if it was anywhere. And that's the best option that I have at this point anyway. I don't know of any other way to explain that. Right. Now, but keep in mind that the pre-flood world as it existed then is gone, okay? It's totally obliterated. So what the flood seems to have done is taken the creatures, the living things of various habitats, and basically picked them up. Their whole habitat gets wiped out, and those fossils, those creatures, get moved and ultimately deposited on the planet in remade material that is nothing like what their original habitat would have been in the pre-flood world. Okay, so that seems to be what's going on. But the humans, that whole habitat, they weren't even picked up and moved. That whole habitat's gone. Now, how do you explain that? Again, I would say the only way I could explain it is early on in the flood, that habitat goes down. The other ones don't, or at least not all of them. There may have been others that did that we don't know about. There is another habitat of the pre-flood world that we think we've discovered that's not like today. It seemed to be a pre-flood floating forest where its roots were hollow. And the reason we believe that is because we find in the fossil record, these enormous coal beds of material we find in flood strata seem to be, a lot of it is from this pre-flood floating forest biome that existed, where it would have had these hollow roots that would have allowed, they probably intertangled with each other and allowed this kind of forest to ride on the ocean. Isn't that interesting? So we think we found evidence of that, but again, the whole human habitat, it's gone. It's gone. I think it makes sense that it might have been subducted. If that's the term we want to use, it could be that it just went down, just sunk. So I don't know.
So with that, is there any research in the Middle East area where they think that everybody lived at that time, where underneath the ocean or anything, where they see all of the different shapes of the bottom of the ocean there or anything, to help back that theory of being sucked down underneath?
Well, it's not under the ocean, it's under the crust, right?
Is there noise that the earth is making down there or anything like that that suggests that it could have done that actually?
Well, we do find, remember I showed the diagrams that show enormous amounts of colder crust that's piled up under these subduction zones. That's, as far as I know, all we know. So it's huge amounts of crust, we would say pre-flood crust, that's piled up down there from the flood. Now, what is the nature of that crust? What pre-flood material was being pulled down there? Is it just ocean floor, or does it actually include, this whole habitat? And again, all we can do is speculate, but we do, at least, that's the one physical evidence we see, is that there is in the mantle a huge amount of, I think, pre-flood material that's there, crust that's piled up. No way to go study it, which is probably the point, right? God doesn't want us to be able to do that.
So I don't know how many parts of a question this is, but Adam and Eve essentially started the gene pool. Population grows, we have the flood, only have Noah and 3 sons and their wives. Where do we, and the Tower of Babylon separates the different languages. So where do we get the different races, the Asian, Anglo, African, the hillbilly chimpanzees?
Did you say hillbilly?
The hillbilly chimpanzees, as you were saying earlier. I mean, where do we get the different races? I mean, I can understand the different languages, but those are usually associated with races too, to some extent. So where does that come about with all the different skin pigmentations and
All right.
all that comes with that?
I've got slides for this. Okay. Let's see here. Make sure I'm not going to be... I don't know if I'll have time to cover this tomorrow, so let's do it now. All right, so where do all the different races come from? Interestingly, first of all, Acts 17:26, there's really just one race, okay? It's one thing to keep in mind. We're just all humans, all right? It's not like there's such a thing as, it's very actually Darwinian to argue for multiple, like, separate human species. In fact, notice what the actual title of Darwin's book, right? You usually just hear, what's the name of his book? Well, it's the what? Origin of Species. They always truncate the rest of it. You know what it really was? On the origin of species by means of natural selection, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. Darwin was a big racist. And he believed that we're still evolving, and he thought the Caucasoids, the Caucasians, were the most advanced. And the rest of the human races were going to eventually die out because they're less intelligent, they're less advanced. And guess who took that idea and ran with it? Hitler. He was influenced by this kind of garbage. That's an evolutionary idea. That's not a biblical idea. But we do recognize there do seem to be general groups of people with slightly different physical characteristics, but they're all human. So how do we get these different physical traits? And usually anthropologists will when they distinguish these, they're looking at more than just skin color, even things like hair texture, facial features, many other kinds of features, gland structures, earwax, teeth, body shape, all kinds of things can go into this. Brain case size. But there seems to be, they used to at least say, that there are 4 races, and they're broken down basically this way. Now, what's really going on to get these different traits expressed? Well, let's look at skin color. We're gonna simplify this. God made it way more complicated, really, than this. But skin color is actually based on like 6 different genes and other factors. But this will give you an idea using what's called a Punnett square that's used to try to figure out breeding characteristics. So skin color as well as hair and eye color is controlled by the pigment that we call melanin. And the more melanin you have, then, for example, the darker your skin will be. And let's say it's controlled by 2 pairs of genes, okay? And we'll call them pairs of big A's and pairs of big B's, little A's, little B's. Big A is dominant, meaning that it produces melanin well. Little a is recessive, where it produces melanin to a lesser degree. And each human has A and B in his genes. Now, this is a Punnett square. It's what geneticists use to try to predict the probability outcome when various genetic characteristics are bred. And so this is showing you if all you had was these 2 pairs of genes, keeping in mind that it's even more complicated than this, and would make it that much more easy, really, to get the variety we're talking about. But let's just say Adam and Eve had only dominant A and dominant B genes, okay? Then their children would have been the darkest possible. All of their children would be the top left box there, skin color-wise. Now, if they only had recessive genes, their children would have been the lightest possible, all of them, the bottom right square. Very light. But if they were heterozygous, so like middle brown in color, having a mixture, so one pair being dominant A and a recessive A, and the second pair being dominant B and a recessive B, then you actually have this entire square on the screen as a possibility. So if Adam and Eve had those pairs of genes and had 16 children, the odds say that in only 1 generation, their children could have had all of this variety of skin color in a single generation. So a 38% chance that their children would be their same middle brown color, 16% chance they would have been darker brown, 16% chance they would have been lighter and pinkish, 6% chance of either extremely dark or extremely light. Now at the Tower of Babel, the various family clans would have then separated, and within those gene pools, various traits like color and any other number of things would have started to gain dominance there because there's no longer as much intermarriage with the other heterozygous options. And so certain traits would start to become dominant and start showing up more in all of the children in that line. And so you would apply this to all physical characteristics, not just color. Now, interestingly, my adopted brother, Chris, he's half black, half white. And he married a girl who is half Asian, half white. So imagine what their children look like. Okay? So they're 1 part Asian, 2 part Caucasoid, 1 part Negroid. Okay? What happens in 1 generation when you mix those colors? This is what happens. All right? So here in America, we are a melting pot of genes. So we see all kinds of shapes, colors, and sizes that you don't see in places where you don't have that mixing of genes that God originally created. They're too sequestered from each other. But when you start mixing it together, I mean, look at how much variety. I mean, she looks like Moana, right? She looks Polynesian. She looks like she's from India. He looks more black, although she looks white, but with some black features. This little guy has, his hair is kind of the texture of black, but there's it's such a mixture in just a single generation. Now, the humankind, we see an enormous amount of variety in the fossil record. The variety we see today is literally only skin deep. But when you get back immediately after the flood, it is more, there's some anatomical differences. You see skull structures that are slightly different. So notice Homo sapiens, we've got a very big forehead, whereas you don't see it on Homo heidelbergensis, for example, and erectus. Look at how tiny Floresiensis is. There's this group of about 3 foot tall humans that start breeding over in the island of Flores in those post-flood strata. The Cro-Magnons are up in Europe at that time. This is what Berger was talking about with the giant humans. That's Homo heidelbergensis, massive humans. So a lot of anatomical variety, but again, we even understand some things enough about genetics to be able to figure out how you can go about getting the various races. All right, what time is it? 4:47. How long has this session lasted? I think we've about already caught up with our schedule here. All right. We ready to call it quits? All right. Who am I turning this over to? Is it you, Cup? You got it? Okay. All right.
Sit here and tell us today. Very grateful for Jeff, your work, your time to share with us, and hopefully you guys have been educated on some of these great things, and we look forward to learning more as we continue in this walk, battle against evil, fight this ugly movement that's going on in the world today that is trying to discredit God.
I did want to highlight one other thing. Again, what I'm trying to do is articulate to you kind of where the thinking is, for the most part, of the bulk of creation scientists. On any of these things I'm talking about scientific matters, I'm trying to give you an idea of kind of where we're at among creation scientists. And again, the things that Scripture hasn't spoken on, this stuff is very much open to theory and thinking about these things and reasoning about them, and they're very interesting and all, but I don't mean to speak with definitude on any number of these type issues. But I do like to highlight the fact that people like Bill Nye, the pseudoscience guy, and others. Like I remember a guy that contacted us through Facebook, and he said, "Oh, you creationists, y'all don't even have any peer review process, so we can't really trust anything you guys say." So peer review in science is important. This is where you have other people that have studied a lot in the subject matter that you're writing on, presenting on, where they can critique your work, and see if it can withstand scrutiny. That's an important part of the scientific community. It's a biblical idea. The first man to plead his case seems right until his neighbor comes and examines him, Proverbs says. Test all things, hold fast which is good. The Bible would promote this process. So this guy's acting like creation scientists don't have that. So I wrote him back because it was total ignorance on this guy's part, and told him, look, we've got creation conferences and creation journals that are peer reviewed by other creation scientists that have studied this stuff. Well, but they're just a bunch of yes men they don't actually criticize each other. They just basically pat each other on the back. I'm like, once again, you don't know what you're talking about. You go to these conferences, there's almost blood drawn at some of these. Because you get some of these guys with their ideas, and there's egos just like anywhere else that get into play, and it gets messy, and that's all an important part of the process. So what I've tried to do, like in the Flooded book, is articulate to you kind of where the thinking is among creation scientists based on all the study I've done of a lot of that peer-reviewed material, and in some cases just weighing in on things maybe that haven't been talked about peer review, but for the most part, peer-reviewed stuff. And I did want to highlight that for you, especially in the young people that might ever hear those ridiculous arguments. Okay, that's all.
Well, you've done a great job with it, Jeff. I appreciate everything you've been talking about. You know, the way I look at it is God has opened his mind to us through his Bible, and that's the foundation which we build on. And like I say, the proofs are there many times over. So to me, what they have is a straw man argument. That's my theory on it. But yeah, let's close out with a prayer today. Let's all pray. Our Holy Father, we are so blessed to be here today. And I thank you for the time that you've given us to come together and learn from great minds about things that we can rest on, things that we can be sure of. Father, we know that you are real and that you are there and you are the creator of all things. Father, we just pray that you'll be with us as we leave this building today. Help us to remember the things that we've learned, and that we'll be able to help others find their way to the truth that you've set forth in your word. Father, I'm so grateful for Jeff. I'm grateful for Apologetics Press and all the people that are working there and helping this cause to go out into the world and to get people to see that there is a truth to be found. Thank you, Father, for men like Jeff that will plant that seed to help people to understand that it's not man that creates God, it's God that created man. Thank you, Father, for all that you do for us. Thank you for establishing your church upon this land. I know, Father, that that is part of the opposition's attack force, that they will come after your church. But, Father, we're grateful to have the blood of Christ that draws us together and strengthens us to go out and stand firm in your truth and help people find their way to Christ. Father, I ask now that you be with us as we depart. I pray that the souls that are with us today have been touched, been blessed, and been changed. And Father, I thank you for their attendance, and I pray that they'll come back tomorrow to hear more from Jeff and more of his lessons for what he's learned and what he's wanting to share with us. Father, I ask that you be with us, keep us safe when we go home, and bring us back at the next appointed time. Thank you once again for all you do for us. Most of all, thank you for Jesus coming to this world to not only tell us about you, but show us you in the way that he loves us and the way that he gave himself up for us. Father, thank you. May we look at that love and be more like it every day. It's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen.